When I was about 7 years old, I was at a friend's birthday party. We went to the local cinema with a group of 6 other kids, my friend and her mother. I had to use the bathroom during the movie, and I told her mom, assuming that she would come with me, because even then I knew going to places alone as a kid could be dangerous, but she didn't go with me. I went out to the bathroom alone. I must mention that it was a small local cinema which was really old, and most of the time it was empty. It wasn't like regular theaters nowadays that always have people bustling about. Anyway, on my way to the bathroom, I saw some guy leaning against the concession counter, seemingly with nothing to do. I thought maybe he was waiting for his kids to come out of the restroom or something. At this place, the bathroom was one small room that was divided into 2 halves. On one side was 2 stalls for men, on the other 2 stalls for women. I entered the bathroom and sat down to do my business. The guy came in about a minute after me. I could see his shadow under the door of the stall that I was in. He was walking back and forth outside of it. He shouldn't have been over on the women's side, and no one else was in the restroom with us, so I began to panic. I stayed in there for a couple of minutes because I was too scared to go out. He eventually left, and I decided to go back. When I walked out of the bathroom, he was standing there blocking the doorway, standing with his arms and legs spread out like he was ready to grab me and scoop me up. My heart started racing. He was more than twice my size, and I was terrified. I thought fast enough to jump through the gap between his legs. I skidded on the carpet and burned my knees, but I got up as fast as I could and ran back to the theater that my party was in. I wish it had ended there. That night at home, I remember hiding this doll that I had because I thought the man was going to come for me, and I wanted to make sure my doll was safe. My mom noticed me acting weird and asked me what was wrong. I blurted out that a man had tried to grab me when I was at the cinema. She kind of brushed it off, but I think that she was trying to act like nothing was wrong for my sake. I could see in her eyes that she was worried. Later, I heard her and my dad talking, and she asked me what the guy looked like. Did he have a black mustache? Did he have messy hair? He did. But how did she know these things? It turns out he was at our fucking house earlier that day, replacing a window, and he must have overheard me and my mom talking about the party. I don't know what he was planning on doing if he grabbed me. Was he going to kidnap me, or something else? I'm just glad he didn't succeed. I brought all of this up to my mom last night. She looked surprised for a moment, like she didn't think that I would even remember the incident after all this time, but how could I forget? She seemed uneasy talking about it, but I eventually got it out of her that the guy was never caught. I'll admit, when she said this, I had a moment of this sinking feeling in my chest. They never saw or heard from him again. She told me that the police had assumed that he had skipped town after failing to kidnap me out of fear of being identified. I can't help but feel worried though. Worried that he may have caught another kid, that they may not have been as lucky as I was. I really hope this piece of shit was scared out of attempting this again, and no kids were harmed.
I once asked my great-uncle what his absolute worst memory was from his youth. He didn't hesitate at all when he told me that it was the night he went to go see the movie Dirty Harry, starring Clint Eastwood. It was 1971. It was at a small theater in Wyoming. My great-uncle and his best friend had bought tickets for $1.50 each to get in to see the movie. The cinema had a single screen, and they were sitting in the very back row because they intended to smoke cigarettes and didn't want to be caught and thrown out. He recalled there being only about 4 or 5 other people in the theater. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the flick, Clint Eastwood played a loose cannon cop who was borderline insane and was on the hunt for a serial killer who called himself Scorpio. The plot was heavily inspired by the real-life Zodiac Killer, and it was mainly that reason the 2 of them had skipped school to check the movie out. My uncle was big into true crime and unsolved mysteries. He told me that as he was watching the movie, he was being distracted by what smelled like spoiled meat. Even the cigarettes didn't help hide the scent. Once the movie was over, his friend immediately wanted to leave and escape the putrid smell. But my uncle bent down and started looking underneath the seats out of curiosity. 2 rows ahead of him, he noticed what appeared to be a meat patty laying forgotten, and he made his way over to it, confused about how it had been overlooked by the staff. When he reached the correct aisle and bent down, he then shot up again, just as quickly, and started freaking out and cursing in shock.
What he had originally believed to be a harmless piece of hamburger meat was in fact an actual severed hand. It was a left hand, with soggy gray flesh, sitting in a thick stain of blood, and a handful of flies were buzzing around it. What was worse is that 3 of the fingers were detached and scattered across the floor not far away. My uncle told me that there was only one employee there at the time. He was a very overweight attendant who was sitting up front smoking a cigar, and the man didn't believe him at all, until he actually brought one of the fingers over wrapped up in his handkerchief. When the attendant saw the finger, he grabbed it and headed over to the theater with a dustpan and broom, looking more annoyed than alarmed. Another one of the theater patrons noticed what was going on and went across the street to call the police. My uncle's friend didn't want to wait for the police to arrive and instead got on his bike and rode home. My uncle stayed and watched as the police questioned the attendant and the man who made the call. The attendant denied everything, even after my uncle spoke up and told them where he had found the hand. The police went inside the theater and apparently saw enough blood on the floor that they took the attendant in for questioning. But they never actually interviewed my uncle properly. He ended up just riding on his bike home, practically being ignored and forgotten by all the adults in the room. He never found out the exact story behind the severed hand, but he suspected the attendant and the other members of the staff may have tortured someone in there after hours, cutting off their fingers first before moving on to their entire hand. The theater was shut down several months later and eventually condemned. I asked my uncle why this was his worst memory and not his most exciting, and he simply replied, "Because whoever owned that hand was very likely murdered, and the killers will never be brought to justice." He says he can still remember the smell of the rotting flesh and the sound of buzzing flies circling around it. So back in the early 90s, there used to be this tiny drive-in movie theater in eastern Missouri, along that narrow stretch of borderline with Kentucky. I would go there often with my 2 older brothers and younger sister during the weekends. We had this flatbed trailer that we would hitch up to our dad's truck, and we would set up our folding chairs and a cooler of beer and watch the movie from our mobile platform. Most of the time, we didn't really care what was playing. It was just fun to get out of the house and have an excuse to drink. I remember this night fairly well because my brother had chipped a tooth the day before and had an ice pack to his jaw. I don't recall the name of the movie we were watching. I think it was some cop movie or something. I had my Empire Strikes Back t-shirt on for some reason, and I remember being barefoot. This was one of the first screenings of the summer, and there were only 2 other cars in the lot. My brothers were arguing over something, and my sister and I were sharing the cassette player and headphones, passing it back and forth between songs. We were all smoking and drinking, and only half paying attention to the movie, when we heard someone yelling from the trees to our left. My brother raised his flashlight to scan the tree line, and after a few seconds, an Asian girl, maybe 18 to 20 years old, came limping out of the shadows. She was completely naked, except for a plastic bag around her waist, and there was a long nylon cord around one of her ankles. All 4 of us immediately jumped off the flatbed and made our way over to her. She was crying and gasping for air, and she collapsed to her knees. By the light of my brother's flashlight, we saw that she was bleeding from a gouge behind her right earlobe and had several bruises along her arms, face, and knees. My older brother took off his windbreaker and put it around her. We all began talking at once. I was suggesting that we carry her to the truck while my brothers were trying to talk to her, asking her where she had come from and what happened. My sister handed her a bottle of water and was trying to talk above everyone else, loudly proclaiming someone needed to go find a phone and call the cops. I noticed another one of the driving customers get out of his car to get a look at what was happening, and the owner of the lot was also making his way over to us from the entrance. The Asian girl continued to hyperventilate and sob, and kept glancing back behind her into the woods. As far as I remember, she hadn't said anything until that moment when she called out, "Run!" She tried to leap to her feet, but staggered and collapsed into my brother's arms. I glanced up and pointed towards the trees, snapping at all my siblings to shut up. I noticed 3 figures wearing burlap sacks over their heads, carefully stepping out of the tree line. Until that moment, none of us had made note of exactly how long the cord was that the girl was dragging behind her. One of the men in the burlap sacks took a few careful steps forward until he was about 10 yards away. He slowly placed his foot down on the end of the line. The frantic girl started screaming. My sister and I were cursing at the masked men, and one of my brothers picked up a rock and told him to back off away from the cord. None of the men moved. I remember scanning all of them for any signs of a weapon, but they didn't appear to have any, at least nothing large and obvious. They were still mostly in the shadows, and the only way that I could really see them was the glare of the movie screen and the wandering beam of my brother's flashlight. As I type this out, I understand how ludicrous this must sound, and thinking back on it now, I constantly remind myself that it wasn't a dream, and I was on the front lines of a terrifying standoff that nearly resulted in bloodshed. The owner of the drive-in finally reached us, and immediately raised a sawn-off shotgun directly at the face of the closest masked man, and told him to get the fuck off his property. From behind us, I heard the sounds of tires rolling across gravel, and glanced back towards the entrance to see 2 pickup trucks pull up, their headlights pointing right at our group. And for a split second I thought they were there to help us, until I noticed the deer skulls mounted on their hoods. The trucks just sat there, idling, as silent as the 3 masked men in front of us. The owner didn't turn around, and didn't even flinch. He called out again that if they didn't get the fuck off his property, no matter what the guys in the trucks did, he was going to shoot the 3 of them at least. The brother not holding the rock had frantically been working with his bare fingers at the knot of the cord around the girl's ankles, but to no avail. And the lingering silence that followed, it was right then when the thought first crossed my mind that we might all die right here. After another few moments, the masked man removed his foot from the cord and took several steps back. His friends followed suit. Without turning their backs on us, they disappeared into the shadows like unblinking phantoms. And once they were gone, the 2 pickup trucks spun out loudly on the gravel and took off down the road. The police arrived shortly after with an ambulance for the girl. A few officers combed the woods, but they didn't find anything the masked men had left behind. It turned out that the girl did not speak much English, and she claimed that her name was Hildegard, but that always felt made up to me. A week or so later, a man's body was found in those very same woods by hunters. He had been beaten to death. It may have just been a coincidence, but I think it was one of the burlap sack men whose friends had turned on him. After that night, we never saw or heard from the Asian girl again, though we inquired at the police station and hospital about her several times. I know that a few different TV news vans showed up at the drive-in, but the owner refused to give an interview and chased them off his property. Regardless of the event being reported and televised, the word got around, and the drive-in officially closed in 1992. The 4 of us were there at the last screening, before it was closed for good. The entire last week, the drive-in was playing Batman Returns, and we saw it 3 times. My eyes were rarely on the screen though. More often than not, I was glancing over to the spot where the girl had emerged from the woods. I was always nervous that a masked figure might be standing there, staring back at me. During the spring of 2004, I was 19, even though I looked about 14. I was 5'0" and weighed about 100 pounds. That's if I was carrying laundry. My parents and aunt were vacationing in Mexico. I had decided to opt out and house sit for my aunt. I figured it would be a nice opportunity to have a quiet place to study for my upcoming exams. And all I really had to do was clean the pool, collect the mail, and restock the fridge with groceries. I also had a plan of action that involved emptying her safe and rescuing her car in the event of wildfires. Her place was high up in the hills of Southern California, with a terrific view of Long Beach. I mostly spent my time in the massage chair in the guest bedroom, playing music in the background while I pored over my psychology notes. Occasionally I would sit out on the balcony and work on my tan, or use the treadmill in the basement, but I mostly was secluded in the air conditioning trying to be productive. Every night I would set the alarm and make sure the security cameras were working before I went to bed. But on the 4th night of my stay, I was really focused on the books and forgot to set the alarm after it got dark. At about 1:30 a.m., I paused to take a break. That's when I realized how late it was. My stomach sank as I remembered that the basement door was unlocked, and I had to secure it before setting the alarm. Before heading downstairs, I wandered into the study to get a look at the security cameras just to be safe. I remembered thinking to myself, what are the chances that someone may actually be inside the house? As soon as I finished processing that thought, I saw the figure on the basement stairs. I remembered my mouth falling open and making a small croaking sound. There was a middle-aged, balding man with glasses, slowly making his way up the stairs, and to make the situation even more unnerving, in one of his hands he was holding a balloon. I stared at the cameras as he reached the top of the basement stairs and looked around before cautiously setting foot into the kitchen. My first thought was to slam the door, lock it, and call the cops. But deep down, I knew it would take the police between 10 and 12 minutes just to make it out here, and in that time, this guy could easily overpower me and drag me into the night. I suppose I could have hidden somewhere as well, but I didn't like the idea of trying to stay quiet while he wandered from room to room, searching for me. Instead, I decided to go on the offensive and try something, and it was both incredibly daring and amazingly stupid. I tiptoed back into my room, turned up the music, and then made a loud production of exiting the room, pounding my feet down the hall. I called out as loud as possible, "Marcus, I swear I heard something downstairs. Put on your shirt and grab the key to the gun cabinet." I was positive my voice was quivering as I said it, but I figured the music playing in the background would hide that fact well enough. I paused for a few seconds, waiting to see if he would call my bluff. But when all I heard was the silence from down below, I power walked back into the study, locked the door, and checked the cameras. Sure enough, he was scampering out of the basement door like a frightened squirrel. I watched him run across the backyard, around the pool, and disappear between the hedges. As soon as he was clear of the house, he let go of the balloon, and I watched it from my window as it lazily floated away towards the Pacific. I ran downstairs, locked the basement door, set the alarm, and called the cops. I also called my parents and aunt and told them what happened, asking them how I could rewind the footage to show the police. My aunt asked me why I didn't just hit the panic alarm on the security pad, and I had to admit that I hadn't even thought of that. To make a long story short, the police caught the guy a week later. He was sleeping in his car in a grocery store parking lot. Everyone always asked me what I thought the balloon was all about, and if I had to guess, I think it was a gift. This guy must have seen me a few times outside the house, surmised that I was alone, and assumed I was much younger than I really was. I have no idea if the guy is still in prison, but regardless of where he is, I kind of hope he hears this and feels stupid. He got scared away by nothing but the empty threat of a panicked girl, with the strength of a malnourished gerbil. So this happened last year when I was house sitting for my neighbor. He was in the hospital for a few days recovering from surgery, and I had been asked to stay in the house and keep an eye on his cats. The house was pretty small, but it was on a nice wide open property by the woods, and there was a tiny swinging cat flap on the kitchen door, where the cats could come and go as they pleased. The flap led into a screened-in back porch, and the house only had one bedroom, so I chose to sleep on the couch in the living room. After cleaning up, feeding the cats, and watching some TV, I shut off all the lights and laid back on the couch. I had my phone out and was casually scrolling through Facebook when I heard the flap swinging back and forth. From where I was in the living room, I couldn't see the door because the counter was in the way, but I glanced over to see one of the cats scamper over and leap up on my legs. I gave it a welcoming pat on the head and continued scrolling. After another minute, I heard the cat door make a noise again, a soft squeak. This time, I didn't even glance over, figuring it was the second cat following the first into the house. Another few moments passed. Then I heard the squeaking again, and then after another moment, it squeaked a third time. I looked up from my phone, wondering why the second cat was jumping in and out like that. I was wondering if I would have to scoop it up and put it in the bedroom. The door continued to squeak for another couple of minutes as the second cat continued to jump in and out. I finally decided that I had enough. I put my phone down and sat up on the couch. I began to stretch. As I did, I happened to glance behind the couch, and my blood froze. The second cat was curled up in its bed in the corner, and the first cat was still nestled between my legs. My confusion turned to fear instantly. Was there another animal on the back porch? Another cat, maybe? I slowly stood up and carefully made my way over to the back door, tiptoeing across the carpet in my socks. The door made a squeaking noise again. I peered around the counter and felt the sensation of my heart leaping up into my throat. And at the same moment, my stomach dropped. By the faint rays of the nightlight in the hallway, I saw an arm reaching through the cat door, straining to get at the knob. The fingertips were brushing at the lock. For a few short seconds, all I could do was stare in terror, frozen by the surreal silent reality of what I was experiencing. It almost didn't feel real. The severity of the situation hit me, and I realized that if the intruder got in, I wasn't going to stand a chance. I grabbed a large two-pronged fork that was used for flipping steaks on a grill, and in one swift motion, I stabbed at the arm right below the wrist as hard as I could. There came a thunderous scream of pain from the other side of the door, and the arm was immediately retracted through the flap. But the fork had impaled the intruder, so it caught itself on the door. That produced a second loud scream, and the arm was wrenched violently outside. I heard the clatter of the fork on the ground, and then I heard footsteps sprint across the back porch and out the screen door. I immediately turned on the outside lights and caught the glimpse of a figure running towards the woods. Instead of calling the cops, I scooped up both cats, stuffed them into the same carrier, grabbed my phone, my shoes, and sprinted out to my car, which was thankfully parked inside the garage. I drove up the road a couple of miles to my place, and once I was safely inside, I called the cops. It took them half an hour to get to my place, and then another half hour of questioning before they continued down the road to check out my neighbor's house. They told me that there was no sign that the screen door had been broken into, and aside from the bloodstains, there was no sign of the intruder. They put out an alert to local hospitals for a man with a stab wound on his right arm. The following morning, the police brought a dog out to follow the scent, but whoever the lucky bastard was, he was never caught. I kept the cats at my place until my neighbor was out of the hospital. It still shakes me to my soul, the idea that the stranger chose that house in the middle of nowhere, trying to get inside. And if I hadn't got off the couch when I did, this may have ended very differently. Back in May of 2010, while in desperate need of cash, I agreed to house sit for one of my old high school teachers. He had contacted me via Facebook and asked me if I would be willing to water his plants, collect his mail, and clean up the place while he went out of town for a couple of days. He didn't specify where he was going, but he agreed to pay me $400 for 2.5 days, with half up front, so I agreed. I never really liked him in high school. He was teaching classic literature, and he always seemed to enjoy pointing out any illustrations that in any way featured nudity. His eyes always seemed hungry, and he tended to wheeze like he was out of breath, even though he was kind of a small guy. My friends and I used to refer to him as Mr. Lip Tit. When I arrived at his place, the key was beneath the mat, and $200 were in an envelope on the kitchen table. I turned on my music, watered the plants, cleaned and vacuumed the ground floor, and made myself dinner. I found his house to be extremely boring. It was filled with old books, stacks of newspapers, and ancient-looking furniture that didn't really look comfortable to sit in. I settled into my sleeping bag on the guest bed, but I had a hard time staying asleep. It seemed that every 5 minutes there was another strange noise coming from the house, and it would put me on edge. The following morning, I went back to my own house, had breakfast, and took a shower before coming back and cleaning the second floor. Upon entering the guest bedroom, there was the faint smell of something in the air that definitely had not been there before. And what's more, I could have sworn that my sleeping bag was in a slightly different position when I had left it that morning. I started getting a bad vibe. I decided that night that I would sleep downstairs in the living room. I finished cleaning just after 10 p.m. I made some popcorn and enjoyed some cable TV, which I didn't have at my place. Around 11, I shut off the TV, wrapped myself up in my sleeping bag, and tried to drift off. I was tossing and turning for a bit, and just as I began to doze off, there came a click of the doorknob turning in the other room. I glanced over, and I swear by any god you choose, Mr. Liptak emerged from the pantry wearing only his socks. He then slowly turned the corner and made his way upstairs. I grabbed my phone and my keys and exited out the back door quietly. I ran around front to get into my car and sped home, where I immediately called the cops. I didn't know exactly how to explain the situation to them. I mean, he wasn't breaking and entering. It was his house. But when I explained to the operator that he had deceived me into thinking that he was gone, they sent out a patrol car. I had to collect the stuff that I had left at his house anyway. When the police arrived, Mr. Liptak answered the door wearing my sleeping bag over his shoulders. The police discovered a butler's cupboard, which was a secret room in the pantry that I wasn't aware of, where he had been hiding with a digital camera. He had taken a few dozen photos of me all around the house, most of which when I was sleeping. I showed the police the Facebook messages he sent me, assuring me that he would be out of town, and they arrested him. I collected all my remaining stuff, but left the sleeping bag. I didn't waste any time getting a restraining order against him. Mr. Liptak made bail, but actually died of a heart attack a few weeks later, after being rear-ended in his car at a stoplight. I never got the rest of my money. My one and only experience with a safe room happened in 2010. It was in a very nice house right on the beach on the west coast of Australia by the Timor Sea. It was my first year in college, and my entire political science class had been invited to a party to celebrate the resignation of the Prime Minister. I didn't know the host personally, but my teacher did, and despite the place being as big as a hotel, every room in the house was packed with guests, drinking, mingling, and making boring conversation. I barely knew anyone except for my classmates, so most of us drank some champagne out by the pool. And after a few of us had overindulged, we started daring each other to strip off some layers and jump into the water. After about 6 people were in the pool in their underwear splashing around and making noise, I figured any negative attention would be directed more at the people in the pool than around it. My bestie and I helped each other out of our dresses, and we sat at the side of the pool with our legs in the water. There was one younger guy around our age who I didn't recognize, who was nice enough to keep refilling our drinks while we sat and kicked our legs in the water. He said his name was Hugo. And my friend Tanya and I continued to make jokes about how he better not be spiking our drinks. He wasn't a servant or anything, he was just being nice. But we knew what he was after, of course, and we figured he would keep coming back to enjoy the view of us in our lacy underwear, waiting for us to get just drunk enough. To his disappointment, I imagine, we both knew when to cut ourselves off, and we eventually stood up and got dressed again, then went back inside. I mingled for another 40 minutes or so, and eventually lost track of Tanya. After returning from the bathroom, I noticed Hugo waiting for me patiently at the end of the hall. When I walked over to say hello, he produced a rose from behind his back. It was so sweet and cheesy that it actually melted my heart a bit, and we spent the next few minutes making out next to a grandfather clock in the hall. He paused for a moment and said that there was a more private place we could go, and I followed him into a back office that was unoccupied. At first, I was fine with it. I figured that he would just close the door and we would get frisky on the desk. The sounds of the party weren't far away, and there were plenty of windows. But instead he led me to a sliding door half hidden by a curtain, which opened into an even smaller office without windows. It had one desk, a chair, and a couch. I walked in for a peek, and it suddenly occurred to me what I was standing in. I asked, "Is this a panic room?" He nodded and without hesitating smacked a button on the wall, and a metal door slid shut with a thud. It was like an elevator door, but much heavier. He whispered, "No one can hear us in here," and began kissing my neck. I don't know if he meant that to be reassuring or not, but it came across as creepy. And I immediately broke away and said, "No way, I'm not doing this in here. Open the door." His expression was confused and hurt for a split second, and then he got irritated. He whispered, "Come on, don't be like that." I pivoted away from him, but he moved to intercept me and was blocking my way out. "Please, I get claustrophobic. Open the door." He kissed me and whispered, "Don't worry about it. Let's use the couch." He put his hands on my waist and tried to guide me to the couch, but I resisted. "Not until you open the door." That's when he put his hand on my stomach and physically pushed me back towards the couch. I distinctly remember thinking, okay, I tried to be nice. I had been harassed and stalked by a neighbor several years before, so I made it a habit to always have something on me to defend myself. I lowered my hands and popped a tiny false pearl off my ring, exposing the tiny pin underneath. I sat up on the couch and insisted one more time, in a stern voice, "I'm not kidding. Open the door. He lowered himself down to his knees and placed both hands on the inside of my thighs. When he leaned in, I cut the side of his face with my left hand and punched him as hard as I could with the right, burying the pin into his face. I didn't hit his eye, but I came pretty close. He immediately leapt back and started cursing and yowling like a cat does when you step on its tail. I jumped up and maneuvered around him. I hit the button and got the hell out of there. I shoved myself not very gently through the crowd until I found my teacher and a handful of other students in front of the hall. A few of them were leaving in their own cars. I immediately asked if I could catch a ride. I didn't tell anybody about what happened until later that night, when Tanya returned to the dorm. In retrospect, that was kind of a risky thing to do, because he could have potentially trapped another girl in there with him. But I figured that I had given him enough of a sting that he probably would be in no condition to get it up for the rest of the night. I never saw him again. I'm not entirely sure if his plan was to rape me, but if not, it was an awkward and creepy attempt at being romantic that severely backfired. Maybe if I was drunk it would have worked. People may accuse me of being a tease and leading him on, but the fact is I just didn't feel comfortable in that room, and he was bigger than me, and didn't open the door after I persistently asked him to. I work for a private security company, and my primary job is a safe room technician. Basically, I am sent to test, do routine maintenance on, and repair or upgrade anything that needs service regarding a safe room or a bank vault. I've only had to physically break into a safe room twice in my life. Normally, removing people from the safety of one is a police matter, and usually just involves drilling a hole through a wall. Usually, people trying to evade the police in this manner eventually come out when they get hungry enough. Or in the case of an emergency, the police will toss in a smoke grenade through the hole they drilled. Once I was called in after the police negotiation failed, and a man shot himself in the room. I had to use a plasma cutter to cut away the outer door and disarm the locks. The man had fallen against the door, so when it slid open, he practically fell out on my feet. Dried blood was still caked over his face and clothes, but the second incident was far worse. A few years later, I was called in by local police to break open a safe room door in a basement. The house was on the market, and the real estate company had asked me to help get it open, so that they could present it to potential buyers. I told them that if it was locked, someone was likely inside, but they assured me that couldn't be the case, because no one had set foot on that property in months. I arrived at the house to inspect the room, taking into consideration that a power surge might have tripped something and sealed the door shut. The agency didn't want me to damage the door, if at all possible, but after running a few tests on the control panel, I told them that it was sealed from the inside, and short of blowing it open and risking structural damage to the house, the only way in was me cutting through the door. They weren't happy about that, but I was more concerned that someone had killed themselves in there, and I was about to have another corpse fall out onto my shoes. After disarming all the locks and messing around with the control panel again, the door slid open, and the stench hit me immediately. On the carpeted floor, lying face down, was a withered corpse of a man. Both of his hands had been resting upon the inside of the door. The agency had gone through the local police to contact me, but they were not on scene. I called them right away, and they informed me not to let anyone enter the room. An investigation team showed up and questioned me. It turns out that the man's legs had been broken in 3 places each, most likely with a heavy instrument, such as a sledgehammer. He had been left to die in the room, being unable to sit up and reach the button to open the door. I went back and disassembled the control panel, and discovered the wiring behind it had been tampered with, potentially allowing someone to seal the door from the outside if they knew what they were doing. That night I told my family about it. My brother-in-law's first words were, "Like the guy at the end of Saw?" And at those words, a sick, chilling feeling swept over me. Some poor man had been brutally attacked and was left to slowly starve in a sealed room where there was no escape, and no one was anywhere near close enough to hear his calls for help. Not that anyone could have opened the door anyway. If the police ever arrested anyone for the murder, I was never informed. The real estate company kept the story quiet so as not to dissuade anyone from viewing the house. Not that it mattered, as the place remained an open crime scene for quite some time afterwards. I told the cops that the killer may have been somebody with a history in my field, but they didn't seem convinced. I often wonder about that man, and how long it took him to die, all alone and in pain, knowing that he was never going to escape. I still wonder what the reason was, and who the last person he ever saw or thought about. It keeps things in perspective for me, and ever since that day, even on my worst days, I remind myself that at least I'm free and can look up and see the sun. People never believe me when I tell this story. My closest friends don't even believe me. My parents didn't believe it when they were alive, and even my own wife and kids doubt me. Back when I used to live in Nova Scotia, I worked for a man that would buy houses and flip them after renovating them. He would try to do a thorough inspection both before and after renovations took place, but there were normally a couple of houses he missed, and I was the one who was sent to inspect those. I don't remember the exact date, but it was in late July of 2000. The rain was pouring outside, and thunder was shaking the house. The roof had been retiled, and I was inspecting to see if there were any leaks, and if all the windows were watertight. I was alone in the house. I was sitting in a small office space which also served as a safe room. It was connected to the master bedroom, and the only way in and out of the safe room was through the bedroom. I was writing up my report and getting ready to leave when I heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. I glanced up at the security feed on the TV in front of me. The security cameras had been set up the day before, and even though they were on, nothing had been set to record. I noticed a dark figure coming up the stairs from the kitchen towards the bedrooms. I knew that now the renovations were done, and only 3 people had the key to this house. The other 2 weren't anywhere near the place. Feeling slightly concerned, I pushed the button to the safe room door. I watched the monitors as the dark figure paused, as though it heard the rumble of the door shutting, and then it continued up to the landing. There were only 2 cameras on the second floor, one at the top of the stairs and one pointing down the hall. I watched as the dark figure seemed to glide down the hallway, peeking in each room. Before entering the master bedroom, my blood turned to ice, and I turned around to look at the sealed door behind me. For several seconds, nothing happened. And then I distinctly heard the sound of a soft, reverberating thumping coming from outside the safe room. I turned back around and fixed my eyes on the monitor, but there was no camera angle to help me see what was happening. For several minutes, I sat there terrified, my eyes frozen to the screen, waiting for the figure to re-emerge from the master bedroom. But it didn't. I broke out into a sweat and tried calling the police on my cell phone, but either because of the thick walls of the room, or the storm outside, or possibly both, I couldn't get any reception. After another few minutes of staring at the screen, I stood up and cautiously made my way towards the door. I pressed my ear up to it and heard muttering from inside the bedroom. I didn't hear much, but one thing I distinctly heard was part of a sentence which sounded like,
"Bury you up to your neck."
And suddenly, another thump came on the door. I was terrified. Not only was this figure not leaving, but it seemed to know I was in there and wanted to hurt me. It was the longest night of my life. I stayed fixed in the chair, staring at the monitor practically non-stop, barely blinking for 6 hours, occasionally checking my phone for reception, but no one ever left the master bedroom. I would occasionally check the other cameras in the house, just in case I missed something, but I never saw any other movement. I finally broke down and dozed off for about 15 minutes before snapping awake again. Dawn had arrived, and light was beginning to fill the house. I didn't see the figure or any sign that it had left. Summoning up all my courage, I stood up. I took in a deep breath and opened the door, half convinced that I would be looking right into the eyes of a madman. I nearly had a heart attack when daylight hit my eyes, but there was no one in the room. Whoever had been there had vanished. I quickly gathered my things and shut the door behind me, and immediately my phone started buzzing, showing me that I had several missed calls. As I was about to leave the room, I glanced back and noticed a small red smear on the outside of the safe room door. It was barely an inch long, but noticeable enough for me to be certain that it hadn't been there the night before. I ran down to my car and floored it out of there. I never went back, but I later sent 2 of my friends back to the house to see if there had been any signs of forced entry, which there wasn't. My family is convinced that I had some kind of fever dream, but I know what happened, and the experience still traumatizes me to this day. I still get nervous about being all alone in large houses. Someone suggested that the figure may have been paranormal, like a spirit haunting the house, and I admit that that is a possibility, but I can't get over the red smear on the door. In my mind's eye, I can't stop visualizing a madman with a bloody face pressed to the door, leaving a noseprint on its smooth surface, whispering menacingly,
"Bury you up to your neck."
Some backstory. This happened when my grandparents were in their early to mid-20s. My grandma worked at daycares and schools for a while, but she quit when she had kids of her own. She would have kind of an unofficial daycare babysitting job at their house, taking care of some of the neighbors' kids whose parents worked during the day. Some new neighbors had just moved in down the street, a husband and wife, and they had 2 kids of their own. This was the 1960s suburbia, very different times. They invited my grandparents over for dinner one night. The wife was showing my grandma around the house a bit, and as it turned out, they ran a daycare center from their house. She showed my grandma the room they used. Grandma had some trouble connecting with this woman, so of course she mentioned that she also ran a daycare at home. This woman immediately got angry with her, asking if it was official and licensed and whatnot. Well, it wasn't, and she explained to the woman that it really wasn't a daycare, just her babysitting for some neighbor kids at her house, and they were just calling it one. This seemed to calm the woman down, and they were able to have a normal dinner. Although the husband and wife kept recommending to my grandparents that they send over the neighbor kids, as well as my mom and uncle over to their house, as they were a accredited daycare center, instead of my grandma taking care of them. Well, dinner went fine, and my grandparents left, a little creeped out, but whatever. A few years later, my grandma was reading the paper and saw that the husband had been arrested for molesting children, his own, as well as the ones that were supposedly safe in their accredited daycare home. To this day, my grandma thinks that the reason that the woman was so defensive is because she knew something was going on with her husband.
There's always a reason to be afraid.
Some background information before I start. I'm a 23-year-old female, and I live in a very rural part of Tennessee, at the base of the Cumberland Plateau in the Appalachian Mountain Range. It's so remote that I can't even get internet hooked up at my house. I have to use mobile data if I want to access the internet. Despite how remote it is, I do really enjoy living so far out in the country, and I expect that I always will. My boyfriend and I have 2 very protective dogs, Roxy and Cracker Jack. We also have grown up around firearms and know how to use them. We genuinely felt safe being alone in our isolated house. We have a 2.5-acre property, and our closest neighbor is over 3 acres away, so no one has any reason to bother us and come on our land uninvited. This happened to me back in late November. I was enjoying my night off from work as a caregiver, while my boyfriend was working late and would not be home until 2 or 3 in the morning. This didn't bother me, as I've stayed overnight at my house plenty of times alone in the past 2 years. I decided to go to bed early and wake myself up in a few hours when my boyfriend got home, so I would be awake to greet him. I climbed into bed with both of my dogs and fell asleep. Around 1:30 in the morning, my bigger dog, Roxy, started growling deeply at the bedroom window and woke me up. I tried to get her to hush, fairly certain there was a coyote or something roaming around our yard, but she suddenly started barking extremely loud. I hear something crash and fall outside against the bushes by my bedroom window. Roxy bolted to my bedroom door and started scratching it, still going crazy and barking while trying to get out. I quickly get up out of bed with my other dog, grabbed my loaded revolver from under my bedside table, and opened my bedroom door. Roxy sprints to the front door and starts clawing at it, like she's going to break it down. I paused and thought for a second before opening it. If it really was just an animal out there, I didn't want my dogs loose to sprint after it into the darkness and possibly never be seen again. I decided to look out the window that was beside my front door and get a sense of what I was dealing with. What I saw more than shocked me. It honestly scared me. There was a man wearing jean shorts and a white tank top running away from the house, heading towards the road. I didn't know if I should release the dogs to chase him or call my boyfriend or the police. After a moment, I decided to call the local sheriff's department. I explained to the dispatch lady what had happened, making sure to mention to her what the trespasser had been wearing. The dispatch told me that they would send a deputy out to my area immediately. She asked me if I wanted to have them come by my house so that I could make a report. I said that I did. After I got off the phone with the dispatch, I called my boyfriend and told him everything. He immediately said that he was leaving work and coming home. When he got home, he took a flashlight and the dogs and started looking all around the outside of the house for any traces of the intruder. He didn't find anything, except for the damaged bushes underneath our window. We waited for nearly 2 hours for the deputies to arrive, but they never showed up. I didn't receive a follow-up call of any kind either. In the days that followed after the incident, my boyfriend came to the conclusion that it must have been one of our shady neighbors that lived a couple of miles up the road from our house. That may very well be true, but what bothered me the most was of all the places the stranger may have tried to enter the house, he chose to try to get into my bedroom window, where I was sleeping. If he was just looking to rob us, why hadn't he tried to enter through the front door, or the garage or back porch? And also, all my neighbors know that we have dogs, and it seems like this intruder wasn't aware of that. I may just be paranoid and jumping to conclusions, but I don't think this guy was interested in robbing us. I think he may have been up to something much worse. I have a coworker named Paul who was in the Navy back in the 1970s upon the USS Shreveport. We got to talking one day about the perils of being at sea and how in some instances the weather can be the least of your concerns. Paul explained while being stationed on the transport ship, the crew used to be paid in cash every other week, which I found strange as they couldn't exactly go anywhere to spend their money and food was provided. He told me that the sailors would predominantly use their earnings to gamble, and playing cards was the usual method. There were a few individuals on board who acted as loan sharks, and during the week in between payments, would loan out cash with high interest rates. Paul worked as a cook in the mess hall. He was acquainted with another man in his division. We'll call this man Jack. Jack was constantly behind on his debts to the loan sharks. Keep in mind, there was no place on board the ship where the loan sharking sailors couldn't find you. And it's not as though you could seek help from the officers. Jack finally fell so deep into debt, he wasn't going to be able to repay what he owed. And once back on land, the debts were nullified. But the men he owed money to weren't about to let his balance go unforgiven. Every day aboard the ship, the crew would be lined up for roll call. One morning, Jack wasn't in his designated spot. He would never stand there again. The entire ship was searched, but no trace of him was ever found. It's only speculation, but Paul believes that Jack met a grisly end and was thrown overboard. What better place to dispose of a body than over the side of a Navy vessel at night? An investigation was conducted. The crew was questioned, but no proof of foul play was ever uncovered. It was concluded that one way or another, he ended up in the water, and it was ruled an accident. The problem with that theory is that aboard every ship, regardless of the weather or time of day, there's a watchman stationed at the stern of the ship, keeping an eye on things, watching for anyone who's fallen overboard and calling for help. For that poor soul in the water, that vigilant sailor, is their one and only chance for rescue. And if they fail to spot you, you're as good as dead. It's entirely possible that the watchman did not see Jack as he floundered in the waves, but the far more likely scenario was that he was already bound and unconscious or dead before even hitting the water. It makes you wonder how many countless bodies have been tossed overboard, claimed by the sea, and forgotten by history. Let me start off by saying that I'm 5'2", 130 pounds, former military. I may be a little bit on the small side, but I don't scare easy. I got hired by a security company working the graveyard shift. I had a specific routine I had to do. Points to hit with a magnetized wand. Keys to unlock doors and gates at specific times. Nothing that I couldn't handle. I was already a bit of an insomniac. and driving helped to clear my mind, so the job was almost ideal. After training on a new route for a few days, I was ready to hit it on my own. This specific route took me to the edge of the city, where the warehouses met the country. There was no traffic and very few light posts. Even the cell service was a bit sketchy. I didn't understand why, but the guy that trained me was part Native American and didn't care much for the route. I soon understood why. The company cars we drove were hybrids, which were very helpful because I didn't have to stop for gas at all during my route. My night started off normal. I picked up my keys from dispatch, checked the vehicle, and hit most of my points on schedule. I had my work phone and my personal phone in the cup holders of the vehicle, and my giant flashlight on my hip. I made my way to the outskirts of town to hit my next checkpoints. I exited the highway and didn't notice anything unusual. No traffic, no people. The area was dimly lit and quiet as usual. I pulled around the warehouse to the side gate where my checkpoint was. That's when I noticed a dark figure standing under the light post a few yards away. Strange, but not a crime, so I continued to make my way forward. The figure simply disappeared into the mist. Now I'm spooked. I froze. I didn't want to get out of my vehicle, but I didn't want to lose my job either. I talked myself into getting as close as I could to the gate without actually getting out of my car, hitting the checkpoint quick, and getting the hell out of Dodge. I tried convincing myself that I hadn't seen what I thought I had, and the figure simply walked away through the darkness. But just as I approached the light post, my damn car turned off. It was like the battery shorted out. There was no lights. It didn't turn over. And soon after, the light post shortened out as well. There was no way in hell I was getting out of my car. I tried to call dispatch on my work phone, but it was dead. Next, I tried calling my coworker from my personal phone. There was only static. In a panic, I tried hitting the steering wheel, and the car turned back on. I floored it all the way to the highway, nearly forgetting to turn the headlights back on. I didn't go back to that checkpoint all night. When I was questioned about it from my boss, I explained what happened, and he simply said, "No one told you?" Apparently everyone knew something weird went on at that warehouse, and no one had bothered to tell me. Either convinced that they were individually crazy, or because they thought I wouldn't believe them. I pleaded to be put on another route, but was softly denied. Before I reached the area the next time I was on patrol, I requested my supervisor to meet me at the checkpoint should my vehicle malfunction again. He informed me that he would be a few minutes behind me. Slightly satisfied, I exited the highway. It was a typical quiet scene, but I was on edge. I felt my paranoia kicking in. I turned the corner to the checkpoint, and the road was empty. I took a quick look around and got back in the vehicle, but as soon as I closed my door, I saw a woman in a pink dress standing in the middle of the street. Slightly creeped out, I closed my door and tried to get a good look at her before calling dispatch. She had long black hair covering her face and was carrying a beat-up summer hat with a red ribbon around it. The woman staggered in a mechanical way to the side of the road opposite the warehouse, leaving me enough room to pass. I decided to chance it rather than wait for her to approach me. I floored it, and the vehicle slows to a halt a few feet past the woman. "What the hell?" I scream, beyond frustrated, punching the steering wheel, calling my supervisor only to receive no answer. In my rearview mirror, I see the woman walking towards me, and then suddenly disappear. I freaked out and started frantically turning the key, but it still wouldn't start. The woman suddenly appeared at the passenger window. She then screamed like she was a banshee on fire. She then banged her bony fists against the window. I was trapped in a useless sardine can of a car, with no way to defend myself or call for help. All I could do was keep trying to turn the ignition. The woman continued beating on my window and screaming about how she can see me. She hit the window again, and it cracked. I considered making a run for it, but before I could decide, I saw headlights. Another vehicle with their high beams on rounded the corner and raced towards me. The woman vanished, but the crack on my window remained. I turned my key again, and the engine kicked into life. The car that came from around the warehouse turned out to be my supervisor. He then called me up, and instructed me to follow him to the nearest gas station so he could check out the damage that was done to the car. Once we got there, he found a few scratch marks down the side of my vehicle, like something had crawled its way up from under it. There were dents in the passenger door like someone had kicked it with a boot, and of course there was the crack in the window. There was no plausible explanation for the damage. We reviewed the security footage from the warehouse and saw my vehicle drive up to the checkpoint in perfect condition. As I began to drive away, the footage went fuzzy. It was only when my supervisor arrived on scene that the security footage resumed. That was more than enough for me. I resigned from my position and decided the day shift was the place to be. My hometown hit the national news on April 16th to April 23rd, 2017. The Facebook killer was found at a local McDonald's and was chased towards the downtown area where he eventually shot himself. This story is about my very close encounter with that man. I'm a 25-year-old female. It all started on Sunday, April 17th. It started out as a normal day. I woke up around 3:30 p.m. as I worked the night shift at a local fast food restaurant, and I'm not due into work until around 5 p.m. Work continued as normal until my boss got a text from his roommate saying that there was this guy that shot an old man and filmed it on Facebook Live. Because we had been here all night, we hadn't heard of it yet, and there were reports of him being seen in our city at a store that was near the restaurant. Although these reports were unverified, and the police said that there was no reason for them to believe that he was here for sure. My boss dismissed it as social media frenzy and misinformation, although he did make sure to double check our lobby doors to make sure that they were indeed closed and locked. The rest of the night went like any other Sunday night. I woke up again around 3:30 a.m. and hopped onto social media trying to see if they found the Facebook killer. To my dismay, he was still at large. But luckily, there were reports that he was spotted in Philadelphia. I was relieved and decided that I would walk home that night. My shift went by slowly, but smoothly. At around 2 a.m. I got out of work and decided that I was going to stop by a 24-hour store that was nearby. I picked up some groceries and was done around 2:45. As I was walking home, I see a man in a white Ford Fusion. I was extremely paranoid at this point, so I dove into some bushes hoping and praying that he didn't see me. The car ended up pulling into another fast food restaurant, but without stopping the car, he turned around and pulled away. I continued to sit in the bushes until his headlights were out of sight. I then booked it home and went straight to bed. The next morning I woke up and found out that the Facebook killer was seen in my city driving, you guessed it, a white Ford Fusion. He had been spotted the previous night about 500 yards away from where I work. While I was in the bushes the previous night, I had seen him shortly before the police chase started that eventually ended in him taking his own life. I understand that this story may not seem very scary, but to me, it could have meant my life had he seen me. He stated on a Facebook Live video that he was going to kill as many people as he could before the police caught him. In retrospect, I probably should have called the police as soon as I saw that car. But obviously, I wasn't 100% sure it was him at the time. I'm still pretty on edge about it, and I feel very sorry for that poor man that he killed. This man was severely mentally ill, and he should have got the help that he so desperately needed before going off the deep end. I come from a small town in central Kentucky. There wasn't a whole lot to do there on weekends, and even less to do when I was a teenager living there over 20 years ago. There was a few tourists that came through the area because the original home of Abraham Lincoln is there, a few miles outside of town. The neighboring counties have well-known bourbon distilleries that have tours available during the day. The two major cities in the state were about an hour away. However, for the youth, there isn't much in the way of entertainment. There wasn't a movie theater or even a Walmart in my county. It's a small farming community where you know over half of the people by name and recognize the other half because you've seen them so many times and just haven't been introduced. On the weekends, if there wasn't a home football game on Friday night, we would just ride around in a 2.5-mile loop and stop at one of the 3 spots where the local youth would congregate. If there was nothing going on in town, we would just take to the country roads and just drive around with no real destination in mind. There were usually a few beers involved, but nothing that would put one in danger. On one such evening, there was a few of us on the road that we had all driven down hundreds of times, when something happened that I will never forget. The road in question is somewhat of an attraction, as it's where a site called the Donkey Tree can be found. The Donkey Tree is a regular tree, except one of the lower branches is unusual, and that it bears a remarkable resemblance to a donkey's head. The mouth, nose, eyes, and even ears, which are two branches splitting off the top of the head, are all distinguishable. As we passed the Donkey Tree, the air changed. It felt like the temperature dropped suddenly. It's not unheard of for that type of temperature change to take place when a thunderstorm is approaching. The intersection of warm, humid air and cool, dry air make for one hell of an atmospheric spectacle. However, this temperature change was different. The sky was clear, and the stars were shining bright. As peculiar as it wasn't something that caused me major alarm. I kept driving in the same direction, and just a bit down the road, we encountered the smell of decomposing flesh. This isn't a very uncommon thing, considering when you grow up in the country, there is always roadkill that stinks until nature can clean up the carcass. There's also the possibility that a head of a livestock had died in the past couple of days, and the farmer who had owned the animal hasn't had the chance to dispose of it properly. It was the strongest decomp smell that I had ever experienced. It was as if it was in the car with us. I sped up the car to try to leave the putrid smell behind us as quickly as possible. After getting a couple hundred feet down the road, I thought I noticed something in the rearview mirror. It was at that point that I saw something that I can only describe as a human head. Only, there wasn't a body. It was only a head that was floating, or chasing us in midair. It was right outside the back window of the car. There are several curves before reaching the end of the road, and every curve I took, the face was right behind us. I couldn't shake it. The eyes were as black as night, and it wore a grin that made my blood freeze. Then, it morphed into a demon head, red face, horns, enlarged canine teeth, but it still had those dark eyes. It changed into more terrifying faces, but by that time it was so much of a blur that I can't even remember them all. It must also be noted that this took place on a short stretch of road, and the time that elapsed was less than a minute from start to finish. My friend in the passenger seat noticed the terrified look on my face and looked back. The look on his face let me know that I wasn't the only one seeing whatever it was that was following us. Through all the stammering that he produced, only one word was audible. Go! It wasn't even a yell. It was barely a whisper. I didn't need to be told twice, or even once as it turned out, because I put the pedal to the floor, and that poor car had the hardest half mile it ever experienced that evening. I should have wrecked on a couple of those curves, but as I neared the end of the road, the floating head stopped on a dime and quickly disappeared into the night behind my taillights. I can't explain why it suddenly stopped its pursuit of me and my friend, but as it did, the temperature returned to normal and the smell was gone, and there was a peacefulness about being there. Later, when I asked my friend about what he saw, he described something completely different from what I remember seeing. Maybe the devil appears to everyone in different forms, even if witnessed at the same time. I don't know about that. I have since moved from that small town in central Kentucky, and I don't often reminisce about the cruising we did as teenagers. However, I still occasionally think about that evening, and even after all these years, it still gives me the chills. This happened to me last spring. I live in a quiet part of northern London and attend a very academic all-girls school in my neighborhood. Since my school is extremely prestigious, we were required to complete the Bronze Duke of Edinburgh program as part of the school curriculum. When our first ever expedition for Duke of Edinburgh was coming up, we all felt pretty confident about it. But since we were a useless bunch of teenagers, our teachers thought that it would be helpful for us to practice setting up. I didn't like the sound of that at all. It was just so utterly creepy to stay in school overnight on some tiny playing field at the far corner of the campus. The most disturbing part about that field was that it faced an abandoned building. Even though it was separated by a stone wall, it still looked creepy. It was one of the only abandoned houses in the neighborhood, and the fact that it was such an oddity made the situation even worse. We came to school in the evening to practice setting up the tents, and it was kind of weird seeing the school without any students in it. It seemed so much bigger. I was in the same tent as my best friend Kate because she was assigned to my group for the expedition. As I expected, I was not able to fall asleep easily in the tent, so I just kept going through my phone until it was late, and I was sure that everyone was asleep, including Kate. I started to drift off around 2 a.m., but then it started to rain, and it was in that moment that I understood that I should have been listening to the teacher's explanation of how to correctly put up a tent, because it slowly started to fill up with water. I imagined that we probably hadn't zipped up the outer layer of the tent properly, so I gathered every bit of strength that I had and climbed outside, leaving my phone. I struggled for a while but ended up successfully zipping up the tent. By the time I had finished, I was soaking wet, so I decided to grab a dry hoodie from my PE kit. I made my way over to our PE department, which had been left open in case we needed to use the bathrooms. The halls were pitch black, so I was really creeped out. I went to the changing room, turned on the light, and changed into my dry hoodie. When I pushed down the door handle to leave, for some reason I found that it was stuck and wouldn't budge. It felt as if someone was holding the handle on the other side. So being my 14-year-old self, I asked quietly, "Hello?" No response. I then asked in a very firm and clear voice, sounding braver than I felt, "Is there anybody there?" Again, there was no response. I started wiggling the door handle so hard that it came off in my hand. At this point, the lights went out in the changing room. The situation seemed as though it was straight out of a horror film. But reality was catching up to me as I understood that somebody really was on the other side of the door, because the light switch in the changing rooms was outside. I was about to have a panic attack, so without thinking, I started banging on the door and kicking while screaming "help" at the top of my lungs, desperately hoping that a teacher or a security guard would hear me. I think it only angered the person, as I saw part of the door which the handle was screwed onto slowly begin to turn. I immediately ran to the other side of the changing room and locked myself in one of the shower stalls, which was really the only place that made sense to hide. As soon as I locked the stall behind me, I heard the door opening and heavy footsteps entering the room. I suspected that it was a man. I tried to silence my breathing with my hand, but I don't think I did a very good job, as the footsteps soon stopped right outside my shower stall. At first, I couldn't quite comprehend what he might be doing, but then I saw an eye glaring at me through one of the gaps between the door hinges. That was the most scared I had ever been in my life. I screamed like there was no tomorrow. I swung the door open as hard as I could, smashing the man in the face. I ran out of the changing room and down the hallway while screaming so loudly, my own ears began to ring. The building was about 20 meters away from the playing field, but I remember as clear as day while I was running away, I turned around and saw a figure in a dark hoodie, so I ran as fast as I could while screaming at the top of my lungs, which woke up most of the people that were sleeping in the tents. I had a panic attack and couldn't breathe correctly for about 10 minutes. I later explained to the teachers what happened. They called the police, but the man was never found, probably because I had given him plenty of time to escape. Everyone was sent straight home after that. I suspect whoever he was, he had been watching us from the abandoned building across the way. That night still haunts me to this day. When I was 12, my family lived in an isolated house deep in the woods. I remember that it was December, just before Christmas, and we were gathered around the Christmas tree in the living room watching TV. At maybe around 10 o'clock, I decided to go to bed. My bedroom was on the ground floor, while everyone else's was upstairs. I remember I fell asleep without much trouble, but later on that night, I awoke, seemingly for no reason at all. I rolled over to face the window that sat next to my bed. The side of the house where my window faced was pressed right up against the trees. For anyone to look inside, they would have to walk through the undergrowth and duck under some branches just to come close. That was the reason that I didn't have curtains. I figured that there was no point. When I woke up, a terrible, vulnerable feeling washed over me right then. A feeling that I had never experienced before next to that window. It felt as if I was being watched. There was no light on in my room, but likewise there was nothing illuminating outside my window either. I stared at the window for a few moments, and then I sat up. I thought, and it was just a thought, that I saw a shuffle of movement outside when I sat up, but I didn't hear anything. After another moment, I laid back down, and even though I felt uneasy, I drifted off to sleep. A short time later, I don't know exactly how long, I woke up again, this time because I was freezing cold. I shivered, rolled over, and climbed out of bed. I suppose I had already forgotten about the feeling I had earlier. I left my room, walked down the hallway without turning on any lights, and entered the kitchen. As I made the turn into the breakfast area, I felt a freezing cold breeze on my face. That's when I literally froze in my tracks. The back door was wide open, and snow was collecting just inside on the floor. I saw the faint outline of tracks leading in, but none walking away. There was a ringing sensation in my ears, and for a few moments I found myself completely unable to move, even just to turn around. That's when I heard the slow, quiet turning of the door handle to my right, which led into the laundry room. I don't know exactly why I ran to the gun in the closet instead of upstairs into my parents' room, but that was the first thought in my head. Get a gun. Defend myself. I took my hunting rifle from my closet and raised it just as my parents had taught me. The gun was not loaded, but I figured the rifle alone would be enough to scare off the intruder. I saw a dark figure peek around the entrance to the kitchen. I couldn't make out any details, only that it was an adult. I'm not sure how well the figure could see me, but I stammered out, I have a gun. What the figure said next, I can remember clearly to this day. In a happy, sing-song voice, the person clearly spoke my first name and then added, I'm not going to hurt you. I'd never hurt you. I didn't recognize the voice. I had no idea who it was, but he knew me. I screamed like I was on fire. I dropped my gun and sprinted back to my room. I locked the door and hurled myself under the bed. I heard the man calling my name as he followed me down the hallway and made his way outside of my bedroom door. That's when I heard my father scream from the top of the stairs. I heard the intruder bolt back down the hall and out the door into the snowy night. It took a while for me to calm down enough to go and unlock the door for my parents. For a while, my parents pretended not to know who he was. But a few years later, when I was older, my dad admitted to me that the man was a former friend of his and had taken a special interest in me. He had repeatedly asked my father if he could take me out to go shopping or for ice cream. When my father refused, he started stalking me around our own property. I never had a clue about any of this. My parents called the police and pressed charges, but if the man was ever caught, I never heard. I ask my parents about him every once in a while, and they always say, it's over, don't worry. This story is not my own. It was told to me by a close friend. Back in 2012, when my friend was 13, he and his family owned a small farm in the middle of a Native American reservation, nestled among a small community of other natives. One night in July, they were having a family gathering. They gathered around a bonfire in one of the back fields and told stories of their heritage and legends that had been passed down through the family for generations. My friend, who I'll refer to as John, eventually turned in for the night with a handful of his cousins. John hadn't been asleep for very long when he heard a manic commotion from one of the barns. He heard the horses screaming, panicking, and kicking against the walls of their pens. He opened the RV door and looked out towards the barn and saw that his father and uncles had sprinted that way already, weapons ready. They called out to the boys to remain in the RV with the doors closed. Before his family could even arrive at the barn, the noise stopped. And once they got to the doors and entered, there was no sound of gunfire. John and his cousins waited by the window for a few minutes, and when the adults left the barn, they were all speaking softly in grave voices to each other. They slammed the barn doors shut and bolted them and patrolled the grounds until daybreak. John remembers watching them circle the property for a while before finally falling asleep. His father was very distant over the next few days and refused to let John enter the barn or tell him what exactly happened. Being 13, as the days went on, John forgot all about the incident, even though most of his family lingered at the farm until long after they intended to. The following week, after the family had left and the barn had been reopened, conspicuously absent of any horses, John began to notice a dark figure that would be seen lingering at the edge of their property, right where the fences ended, staring silently at the farm. Once he got close enough to the figure with binoculars to make out that it was wearing traditional native garbs, much like a shaman or a healer would wear. He never had any desire to move closer to get a better look. He would tell his parents about it, but they would always silence him immediately and tell him not to speak of it, to ignore it completely. After a while, it became difficult to ignore, however, because it would start appearing closer and closer to the house, showing up on the property, within the fence, always staring at the house. John never saw it coming or going, always just standing dead still. The family didn't discuss it, but John could tell that they all had it on their minds. Everyone was on edge, irritable, and seemed on the verge of panic. His father cut himself off from the family after a short while, and almost never left his bedroom. A short time later, John started having horrific nightmares. Each time, he was slaughtered, torn to pieces while still alive, unable to defend himself. Once he awoke from one of those nightmares, convinced the dark figure was standing just outside his window, peering in at him. His siblings admitted to having nightmares as well, so they went into their father's room to speak to him. John recalled the look of hopelessness in his father's eyes. For the very first time, he acknowledged the figure. He told them the thing wanted them to fear it, but if they collectively ignored it, it would leave. That night, John awoke to find his brothers already awake and sitting up in bed, staring at the bedroom door. John could hear a low growling coming from behind it, and then, so slowly he could barely see it happening, the door swung open. Through the door, from the darkness, came the tip of a snout, then a mouth with rows of fangs. It wasn't low to the ground like a normal animal would be. It was much higher up, maybe shoulder height for an average man. John ducked under the covers, attempting to ignore it, but his brothers continued to stare. They later told him a beast, similar to a wolf or a coyote, entered the room, on its hind legs, staring at each of the beds. John's youngest brother screamed, and when he did, the thing seemed to fall over backwards, like it was being folded in half. But regardless, it landed on its legs and sprinted out the door. John heard his father's shotgun go off so close by, his teeth rattled. There was the sound of the front door being wrenched open and something tearing across the lawn, and then there was only silence. John and his brothers were crying when his father came back in. He then gathered them up and told them that they were all leaving and going to stay at their uncle's house for a while. They were never able to get any kind of explanation out of him as to what he saw that night. They stayed with their uncle for a few weeks, and during that time, John's father invited Navajo men to come to the farm and cast banishing spells and prevent the creature from returning. John and his family eventually returned to the farm, but it took him quite a while to grow comfortable being there again. The demon creature never returned. His father eventually sat him down and told him that what he and his uncles had seen in the barn and what had entered their home that night was a creature known as the Skinwalker. He told him that skinwalkers were a part of their culture, and even though they were pure evil, there was no need to live in fear of them. If they chose to live as good people and did not fear the creature, it would never return. It's very important to keep in mind that John was never supposed to tell me this story. The Native Americans take skinwalker legends very serious, and speaking of them in any way is practically attracting them to you. Many of you will not believe this story, and that's fine. I'd definitely rather live in a world where these things don't exist, but I do have to emphasize the respect I have for my friend. I know him very well, and I trust him, and for him to speak openly of this experience took quite a lot of guts. I guess if I had a parting message, it would be to really respect the Native American culture. They have this almost magical grandeur about them. They have faced genocide and had their lands ripped from them, and they're still around, and still hold their culture and religion very close to them, and lead incredibly spiritual lives. I personally think that's worth a lot of respect. In late October of 2017, I decided to take a trip to Japan, just for the sake of escaping the rat race and having an adventure and experiencing something new. I flew out of Heathrow and landed in Tokyo. I had 2 weeks to spend by myself just traveling Japan and seeing the sights. After the first 3 days of exploring the cities, I decided to hit a few local tourist hotspots. One being a particularly well-known forest, where people are known to enter and never return. Upon entering this forest, the first thing I noticed was the sensation of how heavy the air was, and how it felt very oppressive and cold. I was immediately uneasy, and the only thing that kept me walking forward was the knowledge that if I turned back, it would have been a waste of an entire day of my vacation. There were moments when I forgot how uncomfortable I was, and occasionally I was able to admire the place for its beauty and peaceful nature. The forest was much too large to explore in its entirety. I decided to hike for about an hour on the main path, then return on a different path. I was very apprehensive about getting lost. After a while, I sat down in a sunny spot, unpacked my bag, and began to eat the food that I had brought with me. I was nearly finished when a Japanese man appeared from the woods right next to me, as though he had been hiding there. He was wearing a business attire with a shirt and tie, but he looked very disheveled and confused. We looked at each other for a moment before I stood up and extended my hand and said, "Konnichiwa." The man clearly didn't expect to run into anybody, but he gave me a nervous smile in return and shook my hand. He knew some English and I knew a passable amount of Japanese, so we sat down and had a short conversation. I didn't pry into what he was doing there, but he asked me where I was visiting from, and we spoke about my home country of England for a while. After the conversation ended, I asked him in Japanese if he was okay, and if he needed help. He stood straight up and smiled at me and nodded, saying in broken English, "This is beautiful place. Enjoy it for me, please." Then he walked off. The tone of his voice gave me the chills. Now a part of me wanted to run after him and stop him, grab him and keep talking to him, and perhaps persuade him to leave this forest with me. But another part of me was reluctant to get involved. I sat there, wondering who I was to interfere with this man's life. I sat for an hour, hoping the man would return, but he never did. I packed up my belongings, returned to the path, and headed back the way I came, deciding I just wanted to leave. As the sky began to grow dark, the weight of the forest's grim reputation started to weigh heavily on my shoulders. I began to move quicker. When I was nearly out, I stopped as though I hit a brick wall. At this point, it was almost completely dark, and there was still no sign of the man that I had spoken to before. Part of me tried to assure myself that he had taken another path, but the more rational side of me knew that wasn't the case. I pulled out my flashlight and made my way back into the woods. I continued back up the path at a brisk walk, occasionally calling out, "Konnichiwa," and shining my light around to signal him. When I got to the tree that I had been sitting at for lunch, my heart sank. A single string had been tied to one of the branches and led off into the trees. That string hadn't been there earlier. I swallowed the lump in my throat, and I carefully placed my index finger and thumb on the string and followed it into the woods. I had a sense that I knew what I was going to find, but I continued on anyway. Not out of any sick sense of morbid curiosity, but because I wanted to know for sure. I wanted to be able to tell someone with certainty what happened. I followed the string for a couple of minutes. When I paused, in the darkness ahead of me, I heard a faint crying. It was honestly so quiet that I couldn't tell if it was an animal or a human. I waved my flashlight around and called out cautiously, "Konnichiwa." That's when the string started to violently shake. An enormous roar made my eardrums ring. I then heard a shuffle, as if something huge was finding its feet. Against the glare of the flashlight, I saw two pale eyes reflecting back at me. I then ran. I ran for my life. When I hit the path again, I didn't slow down. I tore out of that forest like every demon in hell was after me. When I escaped the trees, I ran to my car and slammed the door shut behind me. I sat there in the driver's seat breathing heavily. I then started to cry for I don't even know how long. Time was irrelevant to me. I felt an obligation to report the incident to someone, so I drove to the nearest police station and I told them everything about my encounter and the conversation I had with the man and how I tried to go back for him. I never heard back from the cops. Since returning home, I've checked the website for the latest victims found in those woods. But since I never got his name, I don't know whether or not he was found. I like to think that he exited the forest another way and returned home and is now doing perfectly fine. I don't know what kind of creature I encountered in those woods, but it was the scariest moment of my life, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone else. When my mom was 17, she and my grandparents went for a hike in the Belanglo State Forest in Australia. They had a holiday house in Berrima, which they would visit quite often on weekends, so going on hikes was common. While hiking along the trail that they had been down numerous times before, they came across a couple of abandoned hiking packs, like those massive ones backpackers have. The packs were stuffed full of clothes and food, but no one else was in sight anywhere, and there wasn't any obvious sign as to why they had been left behind. This was in the early 90s, before cell phones were common, so they couldn't contact a ranger to come and have a look at them. My grandmother immediately became concerned about the strangeness of the situation, and she convinced my grandpa that they should immediately go back to the car, which they did. A few nights later, after they returned home to Sydney, my uncle called my grandmother into the living room and pointed at the TV. Some hikers from Germany had been reported missing. They were last seen in the Belanglo forest. My grandmother immediately cried out that her gut feeling had been right, even though technically there was no evidence that those bags they found belonged to those exact hikers. Other news reports that came a few years later in 1994 had the entire family in hysterics. The remains of the bodies had been found in the home of Ivan Milat. Milat had massacred numerous victims in the forest and is now known as the Backpack Killer, and is one of Australia's most notorious serial killers. It is believed that there are still bodies that have yet to be found. The worst part about it was that the 2 hiking packs my family found were never linked to any of the bodies. This means that whoever owned them could still be buried in that forest somewhere. On my 18th birthday, my 2 best friends and I got a hold of a bottle of tequila and took off in my dad's car to the old arcade by the shore of Lake Michigan. It had been closed down for a few years because, no joke, Jeffrey Dahmer had targeted one of his victims there. The police sealed off the place, and it was never reopened to the public. On the far side of the building, though, there was a skate floor, and one of my friends knew there was a way to break in through there. Our plan was to get drunk and skate around before heading to the arcade. We knew we couldn't play any of the games because the power was out, but we thought it would be cool to look around for old prizes and souvenirs. We parked the car down by the lake and entered in through the side door. Even though it said push written on it, my friend pulled open the door and it swung open easily, but only a few inches before a chain caught it. There was enough room for all 3 of us to slip inside. We each immediately took a shot and turned on our flashlights and began to walk across the wide open skate floor, our footsteps echoing loudly through the large room. There was empty beer cans and trash all over the floor, but we decided to strap on our skates and ride around in the dark anyway. We were the dumbest kids you've ever seen, but come on, we were having fun. We didn't make it around 1 lap before one of my friends tripped over something hard that was sticking out of the ground. We all stopped and shined our lights onto the ground and discovered the obstruction was actually a red candle. It had been melted down so far to its base that it sealed itself against the floor. Being the dumb kid that I was, I took an awkward swing at it with my skate and knocked off a chunk of wax. I was going to keep right on skating, completely oblivious to the possibility of tripping over anything else, when my friend scanned his flashlight around the ground and discovered a circle that had been painted on the floor. Inside the circle were many other circles intertwining, and there were at least 5 or 6 other candles scattered about. I laughed and said, "Some exorcism shit went down here, man." My friend skated into the center of the circle where something had clearly been burned, because the floor was scorched in black. I kept laughing, but my friends were more curious than amused, and kept examining the circle. Another friend raised their flashlight to the ceiling just above the circle, and looked up into the rafters above. She then said, "Do you guys see anything?" My other friend and I glanced up. We saw a few chains dangling from above, and something large and bulky was suspended just beyond them. I leapt up and swatted at one of the chains, which was incredibly stupid because I was wearing skates and fell flat on my back when I came back down. My friend immediately started choking and screaming, not because of me, but because something wet had struck her head when I made contact with the chains. My other friend shined his flashlight at her and we discovered something dark and red dripping down her face, in between her eyes and down her nose. We all freaked and bailed, not even bothering to take our skates off. We awkwardly rolled back to the car, and my friend drove out of the property with her skates still on. She insisted that someone had followed us across the property and that she heard heavy footsteps pursuing us. I don't recall hearing anything, but I was pretty buzzed at that point. I forgot to mention that before we drove here, I had a few beers, and being 18, I was pretty much a lightweight. Unbelievably, we made it home safely that night without crashing. In total, we were at the place less than 20 minutes. That building is gone now, demolished, so whatever was there is long gone now. But that begs the question, what exactly was being suspended from the roof? I'll never be able to answer that question, but I do have a very strong suspicion that the dark red liquid that struck my friend in the face was blood. I'm part of an all-female roller derby league. I would wake up at 6, skate around the local basketball court for about 40 minutes, hit the gym, then meet my team around 8. To be a champion at this sport, you have to be more than just fast. You have to be made of stone, and you have to be prepared to knock somebody down at a moment's notice. I've been with the Flying Banshees for about 3 years now. We were at a match against our most hated opponents. It was at this incredibly old and run-down roller rink. As we were tearing around the court, the lights would often flicker on and off like strobe lights. Add the occasional trickle of water from the leaky roof above, and it was by far the most dangerous course we had ever skated on. We really should have called off the match before it even started, but we hadn't driven 3 hours just to quit. Normally, before we start skating, there's a coordinator who checks us over to make sure that we're not carrying anything dangerous or illegal on our person. It's no joke. I recall one time someone had hid a razor blade in their elbow pads. Apparently that day, no one checked the other team, because halfway through the match, as I'm flying around the rink, trying to put some points on the board, I accidentally flew right into a girl on the opposing team, and she hit the ground hard. I didn't hear the whistle, so I kept right on going. You don't get into a sport like this without having to eat some floor sometimes. I've been flattened a few times now, but I always get right up and get right back into the game. As I was coming back around the track, I noticed she was standing back up and leaning against the barrier wall, staring at me with pure hatred. Right before I was just about to pass her, I saw her pull something from under her shirt. I raised both hands instinctively. The lights flickered, and when they came back on, I saw a pocket knife shoved through the palm of my hand. I slowed to a stop, just staring at it in disbelief. Then the pain hit me like a punch to the gut, and I went down. To make a long story short, I was rushed to the emergency room, and the girl was arrested for assault with a deadly weapon. Turns out it wasn't her first offense. My hand was bandaged up, and I was the first one at our next practice. With the brace on my arm, my teammates took to calling me Claw, so at least I got a pretty cool nickname out of it. One thing that still bothers me though, and sometimes I can't help but dwell on it, but if the lights hadn't flickered when they did, would she have planted that knife somewhere far worse than my hand? Back in the late 90s, my parents used to run a local skating rink in the small town that I grew up in. There wasn't very much to do in town, so most of the time my friends and I would just hang out there at the rink. We weren't the rebellious type. We didn't go out back and smoke cigarettes or anything. We were just all about having fun. Since my parents both had day jobs, the rink would only be open between Thursdays and Sundays, which meant that Monday through Wednesday, I had the rink all to myself. They would often have me meet them there after school, and I would either do my homework at one of the tables or throw on a pair of skates and roll around while they took care of business stuff in the back. One rainy afternoon in February, when the rink was decorated all over with pink and red hearts for Valentine's Day, my mom and I stopped off there after she picked me up from school. I didn't have to do any homework that night, so I had the freedom to roll around the rink while my mom took care of some paperwork in the back office. As I was out on the skating floor doing laps while the Bee Gees were playing over the PA system, I noticed what looked like the silhouette of a person ducking behind the barricade. The lighting wasn't very good. Since the place was technically closed, Only about half of the overhead lights were on. I was used to skating in the semi-darkness, but I would be lying to you if I said that it was completely safe. There were plenty of isolated spots where I couldn't see just beyond the barricade. Me being a dumb kid, I ignored the possibility of a creepy figure crouching in the darkness and just kept on skating. A few minutes later, I made for the side of the rink to step off the skate floor, when an arm shot out from behind the barricade and grabbed my face. A hand wrapped around my face and covered my eyes and mouth. Seconds later, I felt another arm wrap around my neck in a chokehold. My skates flew out from beneath me as I was being dragged sideways, my legs dragging behind me. I couldn't regain my balance because the wheels of the skates kept sliding around beneath me. Had the intruder continued to drag me, I probably wouldn't have been able to escape, but for whatever reason he lifted me off the ground, maybe to get a better grip on me, and my feet left the floor. I took advantage of that moment to kick the guy as hard as I could, and my skate connected with his shin. The guy cursed and stopped in his tracks, and I kicked him again. He released me, and by a miracle I landed directly on my skates and shot away like a bird, flying across the skate floor to the other side of the rink. I glanced behind me to see the figure exiting out of the back door, holding his leg. A minute or so later, I explained to my mom through a river of tears what had just happened. She immediately locked down the building and called the police. To make a long story short, the cops never found who the would-be kidnapper was. I couldn't give a very clear description of him, because it all took place in one of the darkest areas of the rink. Needless to say, this put a stop to my after-school skating sessions for a while. After the incident, we made it a point to check out the place more often and to make sure all the doors were locked and secured. About 5 years later, my parents ended up selling the roller rink. It was just too much for them to handle on top of already having full-time jobs. People have always asked me why I didn't bite or scream or fight back. Well, in that moment, I was honestly so shocked that for a few seconds I didn't even know how to react. I'm glad I had the clarity of mind to kick out when I did, or else who knows what would have became of me. Despite the terrible experience, I hated watching the place being torn down a few years after we sold it to make way for a new subdivision. Something that has always stuck with me over the years, something that I was too young to realize at the time, was that the kidnapper must have known that I sometimes skated in the rink alone. I sometimes wonder, how many times was I skating by myself, unaware that someone was watching me from the shadows?
My twin sister and I rent a small house at the end of a cul-de-sac. Beyond the tree line in our backyard is a chain-link fence, and behind that fence is a closed-down Toys R Us store. Now, I don't recommend that anyone else try this, as it's technically trespassing, but ours is a unique situation, and we couldn't resist taking advantage of it. When big franchise stores go out of business, they liquidate all their stock. Most of it gets heavily discounted for the sake of clearing the shelves, while some of the nicer stuff gets packed up and shipped off to warehouses, where I'm sure they will be sold online, but quite a bit of it is just junked. My sister and I would just watch as employees would exit out of the back and dump load after load of merchandise into the dumpsters. Keep in mind that none of it is great quality stuff. In fact, it's mostly cheap stuff. But the way I see it, once it's in the dumpster, it's trash, and it's free. After business hours, my sister and I would wheel our rolling suitcase back through the trees, sneak through the opening in the fence, and go dumpster diving. We found a few neat things, mostly posters and displays for video games, some cheap action figures and dolls, and a few board games and damaged boxes. We would collect it all, put it all in our suitcases, then head back home. Now, given that we are in our 20s, we knew that we shouldn't have been doing this, but we couldn't resist saving all this cool stuff that was just going to rot away in a landfill anyway. Most of it we kept, and some we gave away to friends, but we didn't resell any of it online or anything. After we had gone dumpster diving about 7 or 8 times, I was getting tired of it. There's always actual trash in the dumpster as well that we would have to sort through, including old food. Ugh. I once had a fly buzz right into my mouth. Needless to say, I was ready to call it quits on the whole thing, but my sister pressured me into doing it one last time. Normally, we would go at dusk, stay for about 20 minutes or so, and then leave. We didn't like going after nightfall because then we would need flashlights, and that would draw too much attention to ourselves. The final time we went was already after dark.
mostly because I had procrastinated as I didn't really want to go. When my sister and I slipped through the opening in the fence, I handed her one of those tiny keychain flashlights and told her to keep it handy while she looked around. She hopped into the dumpster and started digging through the junk, which I recall was just mostly shelving and a few of those plastic displays for posters. I was casually pacing back and forth, watching the area around us, and taking the stuff she handed to me and tossing it into a bag. For the record, neither of us had been drinking, we weren't carrying any weapons, and we weren't acting obnoxious and drawing attention to ourselves. We were barely talking. Yeah, we were trespassing. But that alone isn't enough of a crime for what was about to come. After about 10 minutes, I told my sister that it was time to go. She was making too much noise shifting around those shelves, and I was worried about getting caught. I was zipping up the bag when I heard the chain link fence rattle back around where the opening was. Now, in retrospect, this may have had nothing to do with what was about to happen, but a part of me still thinks it's connected. I didn't have a flashlight, so I couldn't glance over into the area to investigate, but I had entered through that fence often enough to know what it sounded like when someone passed through it, and this sounded like that exactly. I started tapping the side of the dumpster, telling my sister to hurry up. She pulled out a cracked Iron Man mask and handed it to me, and then began to crawl out of the dumpster. Right as her feet touched the pavement, the lid of the dumpster swung down hard and slammed itself right on her fingers. The sound of the lid falling that hard was like a bomb going off. I jumped about a foot into the air. My sister cried out in pain and cursed. The next thing we knew, there was what sounded like a war cry coming from behind the dumpster. A man steps out from behind the dumpster and swings one of those retractable nightsticks right at my head. It was pure luck that I chose that moment to step backwards and dodge the blow. The baton made a loud clinging sound against the dumpster. The guy screamed like a madman and swung again. I yelled for my sister to run. We abandoned the suitcase. We both sprinted towards the front of the building. The guy started sprinting after us, screaming in a language that wasn't English or Spanish. At first, he was right on our heels, but my sister and I were both in pretty good shape, so after a few moments, we left the guy in the dust. Fortunately, we were both in our sneakers that night. The man then hurled his baton at us, and it clattered across the pavement to my right, but we kept running. Once around the front of the building, we began sprinting to the road and the crosswalk. The guy turned the corner and slammed right into one of those freestanding cement poles that are normally located by the entrance to prevent cars from plowing right through the doors. I glanced over my shoulder and I saw him hit the ground, but the man got right back up, like he barely felt it, and kept running. When we made it to the intersection, I shoved my sister in the direction of our house and told her to keep running. This is the part that blows my mind. Not only was the man still chasing us, but he was still screaming at the top of his lungs and wielding a stun gun in each hand, both of which were buzzing loudly as he ran. And I neglected to mention that this man was not wearing a security guard uniform. He was just completely out of his mind. I yelled at someone who was idling at a stoplight to call the cops, and then I took off in the opposite direction my sister went. Fortunately, after I crossed the road and ran down a few back alleys, I ended up losing him, but I could still hear him screaming. I doubled back as I watched him run in between parked cars up and down the street, clearly furious that he had lost me. Then, I kid you not, one of his sleeves caught fire. My guess is that one of the stun guns made contact and ignited it. I cut back around a gas station and made for home. As I heard the sirens approaching in the distance, when I got home I discovered that my sister was safe, although one of her fingers were broken, and she ended up losing 2 of her fingernails thanks to the dumpster lid. I know this story is kind of comical now looking back, but as it was happening, it was terrifying and incredibly surreal. This guy was dressed in a hoodie and jeans and reeked of sweat. He clearly was not a security guard or anything. He didn't announce himself before approaching us. He just immediately started attacking us, and I have a horrifying gut feeling that he may have killed us had we not chosen to run immediately. My best guess is that he was some homeless guy with some serious mental issues. I don't know whatever happened to him, but needless to say, my dumpster diving days are very much over. So the other night, my friends and I were walking to the movies at around 9 p.m. As we were heading through the plaza where the theater was located, I decided to stop and have a smoke in front of the empty storefront that used to be Toys R Us. My friends all paused to wait for me and pulled out their phones, while I lazily peered through the window into the darkened store. I noticed the front doors were locked with chains and a padlock on the outside, and I considered how weird that was, securing it from the outside where someone could easily break the lock and go inside. As I looked past my reflection and let my eyes wander down the rows of empty shelves, I noticed a glimmer of light from down one of the aisles. I moved a few steps over and tried to get a better look at what it was, and when I noticed it again, I realized it wasn't a source. It was a reflection. 2 points of reflected light were staring back at me, like eyes from deep in the back of the store. I spoke aloud. "What? No way!" and pressed my hands up against the sides of my eyes to get a better view while my friends asked me what was happening. The eyes shifted, then vanished, only for a second, before reappearing in a new spot a few feet away. I knocked on the window and called out to my friends. "Hey, there's someone in there trying to freak me out." As soon as I said that, something large struck the window from the inside, and I leapt back. A metal bracket the size of a frying pan had just been thrown against the window from somewhere deep inside the store. My friends all heard it and immediately rushed over, but I continued to retreat backwards. In that split second after the bracket struck the window, I thought I saw the eyes shift again, and I saw a shadowy figure crawl across another aisle. Not walk, crawl, on all fours. Whatever I was witnessing was either a severely deranged human or some kind of unknown creature. My friends started recording the inside of the store on their phones, but none of them captured anything except their own reflections and the darkness just beyond the window. I just dropped my cigarette and immediately started walking away. Even if it was just some prank, I was done. We saw the movie and walked home using a different route without passing the store. And to be honest, I forgot all about the encounter until recently. I guess when something strange like that happens, something that we cannot explain, our subconscious just swallows it, choosing to overlook it because it doesn't make any sense. It can't be categorized, so it just doesn't reflect on it. I did some research, and the building is set to be demolished next month. I can't help but wonder, were those chains on the door meant to keep people out, or to keep something inside? I'm part of an exclusive girls-only paintball club. Normally we meet about 8 or 10 times during the summer months to battle in designated paintball areas, but on occasion during the off months, we choose an isolated private location to meet instead. When the economy crashed back in 2008, my neighboring town went to shit, and most of its residents took off. There was an abandoned shopping plaza that was hidden behind a small section of woods that used to house a Toys R Us, a Kmart, and a Goodwill, before the whole thing was shut down. It's been deserted so long that 6-inch grass is growing up in between the cracks in the parking lot. Of course, there were chains and fences blocking off the property, but after scoping it out, my girlfriends and I concluded that it wasn't being monitored, and security wasn't making regular stops, so we decided to turn it into our battlefield. We broke open a few doors so that we could run through the abandoned stores and make it more fun. Plenty of furniture and shelving had been left abandoned, and we dragged some of it out to the parking lot to use it as obstacles for cover. We spent most of our Saturday afternoon there paintballing and recoloring the place with blotches of red and blue everywhere. We were enjoying ourselves, until we heard over the radio the emergency notice to stand down, as someone had been injured. We all gathered in what used to be the Toys R Us stock room. We discovered that our friend had fallen into a shaft that had been hidden underneath a tarp lying on the floor. It was about an 8-foot drop, and was only accessible by a ladder that led down into a basement area. Our friend was bruised and shaken, but she would be fine. A few of us helped her climb out, but myself and 3 others took flashlights down into the section of basement, and we soon discovered something very unnerving. There was a row of iron shackles bolted into the wall. There were scratch marks on the floor and wall, with what looked to be dried blood. It resembled some kind of torture chamber. A feeling of dread overwhelmed me. I can't explain it, but have you ever been to a place where you could just tell Something terrible had happened there. The iron chains did not appear to be that old. One of my friends approached one of the scratch marks on the wall. She then turned to the rest of us. "This is fresh." We gathered up our crew and left, making sure to take everything with us that may have left clues as to who exactly we were. We anonymously reported our findings to the police and never returned to that property again.
There's always a reason to be afraid.
My most vivid memory of the late 90s was the Clinton Lewinsky scandal. Not because of the scandal itself, but because of the coverage of it. I remember my parents were pissed off at Clinton and kept calling him the deadbeat president. I couldn't watch any TV because they had the news running non-stop. We lived in Maryland, and my dad knew somebody who knew President Clinton personally. So they were getting details about what was going on behind the scenes. To clarify, my dad worked for the Department of Defense at the time, and Clinton being removed from office would have resulted in some kind of power shift, and his direct superior being promoted. What did I care? I was just a kid. I just wanted to watch Rocko's Modern Life. I remember my parents inviting over about 10 people, and while they had loud conversations downstairs as the TV was playing, I was up in my room, being a bitter kid. My parents wouldn't let me take the smaller black and white TV out of the closet. They couldn't get it to tune into the channel I wanted to watch anyway. I was sitting in my bed, listening to one of my cassette tapes, trying to drown out the annoying, serious adult conversation taking place downstairs. When I happened to glance out the window, down in the backyard, I saw a man I didn't recognize move across the yard quickly in the dark, avoiding the patches of light cast by the downstairs windows. I got out of bed and looked out my window at him. I remember that he was bald and very tall, taller than my dad. But I figured that he was just one of the guests that were visiting. Who cares about what he was doing in our backyard? I watched him more out of boredom than anything else. The man cautiously came closer to the house, peering into the ground floor windows. I was about to go back over to my dresser and flip my cassette tape over, when the man tossed something about the size of a video cassette into the doghouse. Now, our dog Gemini had just died a few weeks before. I didn't like this strange man touching the doghouse for any reason. So like the obnoxious kid I was, I walked out onto the landing and called out to my parents below. The tone of my voice left no doubt that I was unhappy and wanted the situation resolved immediately. I remember the silence that followed lasted way longer for my liking. "What man?" my mother called back up to me. From down below, all became quiet. All I could hear was the TV. To this day, I have never seen my dad move so fast. He shot up the stairs, picked me up, and came back down. My mom and the other house guests followed. We all had to wait at the neighbor's house across the street while the police and the bomb squad came. I don't think I realized the severity of the situation until I was much older, but at the time I was more annoyed than afraid. I was asked to share everything that I saw, but the only way I could describe the man was saying that he looked like Captain Picard. I wasn't the best at descriptions. I don't remember most of what happened next. We eventually got to go back into our house. My dad died of blood poisoning in 2005, and my mom passed away of natural causes in 2007. They never told me exactly what the package was, whether it was a bomb or a threat of any kind, but it was definitely something serious. The police would come back and show me pictures of possible suspects. I don't remember ever identifying the stranger in our backyard. I live in Vermont now, and I really have no ties to the people that my parents knew, but I have a creepy story for the ages that always entertains at parties. Several decades ago, my grandfather used to have this crazy neighbor who lived on a ridge overlooking his home in central Missouri. The guy was an insane conspiracy nut who didn't allow electronics of any kind on his property and refused to recognize the local police department's authority over him. People in the neighborhood called him Tanner. I guess you could label him as what's called a sovereign citizen. The guy had an arsenal of various weapons, killed animals for meat, brewed his own booze, and grew his own vegetables. My grandpa lost track of how many times the police drove past his house to climb the ridge and confront him. There was once a standoff that lasted most of the day, where the guy wouldn't leave his house until the cops had to pull his front door off with a chain tied to a truck. He would spend brief periods of time in jail for disorderly conduct, hunting on other people's property, and resisting arrest, but he would always return home eventually. The cops warned my grandfather's family that the guy was not to be approached for any reason, and if there was ever a problem, just call them instead. They reported that Tanner set traps in his own lawn and had shackles and chains in his back room. My grandfather only has one distinct memory of him. One winter, he was smoking on his back porch when the crack of a rifle being fired way too close made him jump, and a short-tailed hawk fell out of the sky, bounced off the porch railing right next to him, and landed on his lawn. My grandfather leapt up in shock as the hawk thrashed on the ground. From the ridgeline above, he heard the man yell, "Don't touch him, he's mine." My grandpa shouted back at Tanner that he would call the cops if he came down onto his property. He then went inside and locked the door. Where the real story starts is in the spring, sometime in the early 80s. A rust-colored panel van broke down on my grandfather's street, and the driver pulled off to the side and parked right in the dirt path that led up to Tanner's place, probably not even realizing that it was a driveway. A few hours later, there was a pounding on my grandfather's door. He found 3 very large men asking if he was the one who broke into their van and stole their stuff. My grandfather, not without a good reason, pointed them up the hill towards Tanner's place, and the 3 made their way up the dirt path. From here, I'm going to speak about what the police eventually reported to my grandfather. The 3 men kicked in Tanner's door when they arrived, and the first one through the door stepped into a bear trap. It was laid out on the floor in the dark hallway. Then Tanner, who had apparently been waiting for them outside in the bushes, hit the other 2 with bear mace and forced them down the hall into his back room, where he attempted to subdue them and chain them to the wall, but one escaped. Nearly blind, he stumbled into what the police described as a barbed-wired net that Tanner had set up near his back door. From down the ridge, my grandfather sat by his shed and waited to hear the commotion. But when he started hearing screams and gunshots, he called the police. When the police arrived, they found the front door wide open and several small traps set throughout the house, including an axe that was made to swing down from the ceiling. One of the men were found shackled in the back room with a knife shoved through his hand. The man in the net had been shot 4 times and was left to bleed out. Tanner was nowhere to be found. When my grandfather asked what happened to the 3rd man, the police reported that there were only 2 found in the house. Both men survived and were taken to the hospital, but afterwards they were arrested for outstanding warrants. The police didn't specify, but they implied that they had been smuggling drugs or stolen goods in the van, and that's what Tanner had stolen from them. Tanner himself was never seen after that, though my grandfather did hear a report on the radio a few years later that a man matching his description was found dead in a ditch in Kentucky. I've always considered that to be one of the craziest home invasion stories I've ever heard, and to this day my family still jokes around about the missing bear trap man. Shortly after that happened, my grandfather moved across state to a different house, but he did return once to his old house just for a look, and he could have sworn that he noticed somebody looking down at him from the hill above. When I was a kid, my family moved into a house in the suburbs of Ottawa, Ontario. It was a pretty normal residential neighborhood with houses on each side of the street. There was a neighbor that stood out from the rest. When my dad went across the street to introduce himself, he immediately got a strange vibe. She barely spoke and wouldn't open the door more than a crack. She seemed very secluded and shy, and she didn't even give her name, so we ended up calling her Crazy Lady. One day I was playing outside with my brothers. We were having fun, but there was this overwhelming feeling that somebody was watching us. I tried not to think about it too much, but suddenly I heard a knocking sound on a window from the house across the street. I look over at the Crazy Lady's house. She was standing in front of her window watching us playing in our driveway. We made eye contact for a moment, and I quickly looked away, wondering why she was just standing there watching us. I was also wondering how many times she had done this, and we just hadn't noticed. I went inside and told my parents, but they said not to worry about it. It seemed that every time we were outside, I noticed her standing in her front window. She never smiled or waved, just stared. The only time she would ever speak to us was when a ball or something else we were playing with rolled into her driveway and we had to go fetch it. She would come outside and almost immediately start yelling at us, telling us to get off her property. Fast forward about 5 years, and my neighbor finally disappears. It was as if, one night, she just up and left. No one in my family was sorry to see her go. But even when she left, that wasn't the end of it. One night not long after, we heard sirens outside of our house. The fire department and paramedics had all gathered outside the crazy lady's home. My mom went over to them and tried to explain that the house was empty, but they responded that they had received a call from a medical alert necklace at that address. We all went back to sleep, assuming something had gotten mixed up and they just ended up at the wrong address. Eventually, a new family moved into the house. We all went over to introduce ourselves, and we got to talking about the woman who used to live there. They seemed confused and told us that they had owned that property for many years, and no one, at least according to them, was supposed to be living there. Eventually, through their oldest son, my family and I learned 2 things later on. Upon re-entering the house, there had been a single chair facing the window in front of the living room, and that no one could remember leaving it there. Second, down in the basement, there was a small room, more of a storage space really. It was locked from the inside, and the family couldn't access it. The parents never remembered it being locked or requiring a key. To the best of my knowledge, they never got access to the space. But I couldn't help but wonder, even years later, if the remains of that old woman were down there, behind that locked door. I have a faint memory of being involved in the Rodney King riots back in 1992. I was only 7 at the time. We had originally been stacking empty beer cans in my friend's fenced-in backyard when the commotion started. We heard a lot of yelling and cursing and police sirens. Even a few loud pops, which I didn't understand at the time were gunshots. We all wandered over to the chain-link fence and watched the rioters up the street. They were shouting and breaking windows, getting into fights with cops and other random pedestrians. I have no recollection as to who was babysitting us that day, but needless to say, they did a piss-poor job. My friends and I actually left the enclosed yard and wandered out into the street to get a better look at the chaos, completely oblivious to the fact that what we were watching wasn't a show and one of those stray bullets could have easily killed us. We would watch 2 people fighting from a safe distance, then something else would catch our eye, becoming more and more separated from the backyard. One of my friends witnessed a shop being looted and asked us if we wanted any candy. He was a bit older, maybe 11. He crossed the street and peered through the broken glass, apprehensive about going inside because of all the infuriated adults around breaking things. I eventually got separated from all my friends. Most of the memory is a blur. I remember at one point getting scared when I realized that I didn't recognize anything. I ran into an alley and crouched down to watch. I remember seeing a cop take a corner pretty hard and flipped a man over the hood of his patrol car. A group of other men rushed the car before the cops could get out and started banging on the windows. In the alley across from me, I saw 3 or 4 other men pouring gasoline into a dumpster and lighting it on fire. I remember finding that fascinating, seeing a fire burning in something other than a fireplace or a ring of stones. I watched the fire grow bigger and bigger, completely oblivious to the world around me. I wanted to look closer, but I was too scared about crossing the street because there were so many people running around. I remember one woman walked past me down the alley. She came up to me and kissed me on the forehead and said, "God bless you, child. Get yourself home." Before I could even respond that I didn't know where home was, she was gone. She lit a cigarette and disappeared down the alley. I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe only 20 minutes, maybe longer, but the dumpster fire was still raging, and I continued watching it. The next part stands out the clearest in my mind. A man in a green and white windbreaker turned the corner into the alley, saw me, and grabbed me by the shirt collar. He reeked of smoke, sweat, and gasoline. He might have been one of the men from before who started the fire, I'm not sure. He started dragging me across the road towards the dumpster fire. He was cursing and swearing at me, and I began to panic. I suddenly became afraid that he was going to toss me into the fire, as I could see the flames coming closer and closer. I wasn't sure if that's exactly where we were heading, or if we were just going in that direction, but I squealed and kicked in protest until he put me into a headlock and cut off my air. When we got to the far side of the street, I could feel the heat of the fire on my face. Suddenly, a bigger man grabbed the man holding me and threw him against the wall and punched him in the face. I remember staggering to the ground and watching in horror as the bigger man pressed my kidnapper's face to the side of the dumpster. The man screamed louder than I knew a human could scream. I remember the briefest smell of burning meat. I then took off running down the sidewalk. After that, it's mostly just blurry. I remember tripping and falling, and another woman picking me up and telling me to go into the church and sit down. I must have sat there in the pews until someone recognized me and brought me home. I really don't remember the details. Remarkably, I was mostly unharmed, aside from a few scrape marks. One of my friends had to be rushed to the hospital after someone had thrown a TV out of a high window and some of the glass hit him in the face when the TV hit the sidewalk, but he turned out to be okay. I don't know if that bigger man was coming to save me or just had beef with the man who grabbed me, but I often wonder what happened to the man in the windbreaker. I wonder if that bigger guy killed him after pressing his face to the side of that scalding hot dumpster. Seeing fire calls that memory back. I could be watching a movie and see a bonfire in the background, and that scream will echo in my head. Considering what could have happened to me, I think I got off lucky. I live in a dirt cheap housing complex in Detroit. Last year, I was in the process of moving in. I hadn't even been there 2 full days. It was about 11 at night, and the majority of the house was dark because I hadn't plugged in most of my lamps yet. I was upstairs in the smaller bedroom, hanging up some clothes, when I heard the front door open downstairs. The door was old and warped, and once it was fully shut, you really had to fight to force it open, twisting the knob as far as you could, and then putting your shoulder into it. It wasn't locked, mostly because I figured that there was no point. No one was going to bother trying to break into this old, decrepit place. I stood up and walked out into the hallway and looked down into the dark living room below. I heard someone rummaging around in the kitchen, where I had left my phone and laptop on the counter. Figuring that it was my friend who came back because she forgot something, I called out, "Hey Patty, is that you?" Silence from downstairs. Now, I consider myself to be a pretty tough person, but I can also be extremely reckless. I yelled out angrily and stormed down the stairs, convinced that someone had wandered into my house to rob me. I grabbed an umbrella I left on the stairs, ready to wield it like a sword. There was no thought in my mind about what would happen if the intruder had a gun, or if there was more than one of them. When I turned the corner into the living room and looked into the kitchen, there was no one there. I stood still for a moment and just listened. The only light on the ground floor was coming from a single lamp that I had plugged in by the stairs. There was enough light to see that there was no one there. Deciding not to let my guard down, I took 3 careful steps forward, umbrella raised high, and turned my head to look at the far side of the kitchen where the pantry is. Right as I did, the pantry door swung open softly. It wasn't completely closed, so when it opened it barely made a whisper of a sound. The man who stepped out from behind looked me dead in the eye, and I nearly fell to my knees in terror. From beneath the man's hood, his face looked pasty and melted. His skin was stretched so thin across his skull, it looked like a layer of cellophane. His mouth was a sideways gash, and his nose was barely more than a lump protruding from just below his eyes. Both of his eyes were open so wide, they looked as big as light bulbs. I dropped my umbrella and took a step back. I was petrified, convinced in that moment that it was some kind of demon, ready to drag me down to hell. The figure had my laptop and a container of cold turkey in his arm. In his other hand, he held an ice pick that was pointed at my face. He muttered in a slurred voice that he was leaving, and just like that, he power walked out of my living room and into the night. I fell to my knees on the kitchen floor and tried to catch my breath. The man hadn't been physically large or imposing. In fact, he was shorter than I was. But his face had caught me so off guard that my insides turned to ice water. From outside, I heard a car horn and the squeal of tires, and the sound of someone yelling. I crawled over to the door, intending just to slam it shut, but then I noticed the headlights of a car stopped in the road. The container of food was splattered all over the ground, and my laptop was right beside it. A man climbed out of the car and cried out for someone to call the cops, that some idiot had run out in front of his car, and he struck him. It took the police close to an hour to arrive, and of course by that time, the intruder was gone. I was sitting on my front step wrapped in a blanket and smoking a cigarette when the cops came over, and I described the man's face as best I could, to which the cop asked, "Like a burn victim?" I nodded my head. He said he knew exactly who that was, and that they would look around for him and check the hospitals in case he was badly hurt. They said his name was Marvin, and that he had been trapped in a burning car when he was a kid, and now he was homeless and mostly broke into cars looking for valuables to pawn. I didn't go out onto the street to collect my belongings. I felt awful, like I had just deprived a man of the only meal that he was likely to get that night. It crossed my mind that he had been trying to hide in the pantry, and that he was more scared of me than I was of him. I never found out what happened to him, but I do hope he's okay. When I was 17, I worked on my grandfather's horse ranch in Colorado. This was back in the late 80s, when throwing the football around and drinking were all there was to do, when I wasn't cleaning out the barn or feeding the horses. At the time, both my father and my grandfather were well known throughout the community as being upstanding people, and it seemed as though everyone who encountered them in town was on a first-name basis with them. As a result, that made me well known during social gatherings as well. I don't remember the exact date, but it was late November or early December of '88. I was horseback riding deep through the backwoods with my cousin Roy. It was the furthest we had ever traveled back into our family's property, and we were enjoying the sensation of exploring a new place. I was focusing mostly on the compass because I didn't want to get lost, but Roy was scanning the tree line for new landmarks and anything interesting worth investigating. I wasn't expecting him to find anything, so I nearly fell off my saddle when he pointed out what appeared to be an RV parked amongst the trees. We made our way towards it on the horses, and discovered it to be one of those old-fashioned truck RV campers that had its own power supply. It wasn't really parked on a dirt road or anything. It was more of an open avenue between the trees wide enough to fit through. I had no idea which direction the closest road was. My very first thought was that it had to be abandoned, but the closer we got, the more obvious it became that it was in pretty good shape. Almost new, I would say. I stepped down off of my horse and knocked on the door. I was curious to know if someone was living out here on our property and therefore trespassing, or if it belonged to the 24 or so people my grandfather knew from town, and most likely I would know them as well. After knocking several times, I tried the handle to discover that it was locked. Now the practical thing would have been to note our position and head back home, and ask our family if they knew what it was. But we were teenagers and had no common sense. We wanted to explore further, and went to the far side and discovered the window opposite the door was cracked. I pulled it halfway open and peered inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It was like a wave of burnt bacon mixed in with stale tobacco. Roy jokingly asked me if I found any bodies in there as I peered around. It was late in the morning and the sun was high, and even though there weren't any lights on in the camper, I could see well enough by the light peeking through the cracks in the window blinds. There was a couch, a small table, some ugly carpeting, and about 3 different ashtrays at least. "Hello?" I called out. I stated my name. After a few moments of silence, I concluded that there was no one there. I peered my head further in to get a better look. I saw a tiny kitchen area with a sink, countertop, and cabinets. I was about to pull my head back out when I noticed something. One of the cabinet doors was ajar, and I could see something large and bulky was preventing it from shutting. I stared at it hard. I then walked out into the woods and found the longest stick I could easily carry, and walked back. "What is it?" I didn't answer him, and carefully extended the stick into the camper. After a few close scrapes on the cabinet door, I managed to knock it open a bit wider. My stomach sank. and my heart started racing. I pulled the stick back and turned to my cousin. "What does that look like to you in the cabinet?" I pointed. I didn't tell him what I thought it was. I wanted to see if he identified it as the same thing I did at first glance. Roy peered inside and stared for about 3 seconds. "Shit. I don't know what that is." "But what does it look like?" I insisted. Roy was silent for another few moments, and then jumped back from the window. "Holy shit, is that a head? Like a human head?" I peered in again. What the thing in the cabinet definitely looked like was a human head lying on its left ear, facing the back of the cabinet, so all I could really see was the dark hair and the right ear. I couldn't see the neck very well, as it was still out of sight behind the cabinet door. "No way that's real." Roy tried to laugh. I wanted to agree with him, but the cold pit in my stomach wasn't letting me. Something about the hair had that disheveled look, and the skin was a clammy white, and there was this rotten meat smell from inside. "Well, what else could it be?" I remember asking Roy. I wanted him to say something ridiculously obvious that it might have been, but he only shrugged. I picked up the stick again and stuck it through the window for a second time. I wanted to physically poke at it so I could get a better sense of what it was. I leaned in as far as I could and caught the cabinet's edge with the stick and tried to swing it further open. That's when a cold hand grabbed my arm and knocked the stick out of my grip. I only remember the next few moments as a blur. I can recall the feeling of an intense shock and jerking my arm backwards. I caught a glimpse of a bare-chested, bearded man. I wrenched my arm back as hard as I could and was surprised when he let go of it casually. But the thing that made me most horrified in that moment wasn't seeing the man's face, but catching a glimpse of what appeared to be a second head on a shelf at the far side of the camper over the man's shoulder. I yelled at Roy to run to the horses, and we both mounted up and rode out of there as fast as we could. I recall hearing the camper door swing open hard, and the sound of a rifle being fired. We didn't look back for several minutes, until we were in a familiar area. We then slowed down and changed direction as we made our way back to the house. Roy and I immediately encountered my father coming down the stairs as we sprinted into the house. We told him everything, possible decapitated head and all. I'll never forget the look on my father's face. He didn't seem surprised or alarmed, only annoyed. He told us to get the horses back in the barn, and that no one was to call the police. He would handle it himself. With our adrenaline still racing, Roy and I returned the horses to the barn and made our way back to the house. My dad made us wait in the living room for our grandfather to come home. And when he did, the four of us sat down at the dining room table and had a long talk. My grandfather looked us both dead in the eye and said if we ever spoke about this to anyone, we would be denied our inheritance of the ranch. We never discussed it again beyond that point. But Roy and I still talked about it plenty. We even rode out there a week later to see if the camper was still there, but it was gone. We followed the wheel marks for over 3 miles of bush and leaves. We tracked it to a dirt road, where we lost the trail. My grandfather died in 2003, and my father recently passed away of heart failure earlier this year. Given our inheritance is secure, I finally decided to write about this experience, because the memory has been haunting me for years. Roy and I speculate that my father and grandfather knew the man that was out there, and even had their permission to be there. But when we stumbled across him and he shot at us, everything changed, and he was driven off of the property. Had my father just blown it off and told us we were crazy, I may have slept better that night, but the fact that we were threatened into silence made me think that the matter was deadly serious, and maybe those heads we saw were real. I feel in my bones that my family helped shelter a dangerous man and potentially cover up his crimes. I feel something may be unearthed one day that will come back to haunt us. My aunt had a near-death experience back in 1996. She and a friend had gone out to the bar one Friday night determined to each find a guy to bring home. They both were single and daring at the time and wanted to try something adventurous. Since this was the 90s, they didn't have cell phones so that they could text each other, so they both came up with visual cues to look out for. If they removed their earrings, that meant they had found a guy that they liked, and if they held their hand to the back of their neck in a casual manner, that meant, "Come save me." Before it was common to have conversations with one eye on your phone, this was how people got themselves out of awkward situations. My aunt told me how she mingled with the crowd for a bit and let a few guys buy her some drinks, before zeroing in on a man who was eyeballing her from across the bar. He gave her a wink, but didn't come over to buy her a drink. She was intrigued by his interest. She crossed the bar and went over to him. She told me that he had a biker jacket on with a gold watch that had a leather band. She remembered that detail because her boss had wore the exact same type of watch, and she used it to break the ice. They danced for a few minutes, and upon heading back to the bar, she removed her earrings, deciding that this was the guy she wanted to spend the night with. He said his name was Harrison. They got a table in the corner, and she let him buy her a drink. After a while, she lost track of time. She began to feel a bit sluggish and nauseous. She decided that she had overdone it with the cocktails. She glanced around the bar, but couldn't find her friend anywhere. Feeling shaky on her legs, she excused herself to the restroom, hoping that was where her friend was, but no such luck. She left the bathroom and headed straight for the door, suddenly not feeling up to having company over. She began to hail a cab when Harrison came out of the bar and asked her if she needed a ride home. She had hoped to slip away, afraid she may be sick and make a fool of herself, but she decided to risk it for the sake of getting a ride home and possibly getting his phone number. On the route home, she was feeling a bit better, and she started getting flirty with him. When they parked in her driveway, she invited him in. They went through the front door, and my aunt dropped her keys on the stairs on the way to the living room. They made out on the couch for a few minutes, but suddenly my aunt felt sick to her stomach, and she apologized and told him that he had to go. She said he was very understanding, and hoped that she would feel better soon. They made plans to meet the next Friday night at the same bar. Harrison let himself out, and my aunt locked the door behind him. Feeling disappointed and gross, she went to bed, but couldn't fall asleep, because her head wouldn't stop spinning. Just past midnight, she heard movement from downstairs. She sat up in bed and listened closely. She knew her parents were both still out of state. She had spoken to them on the phone before she left that night. No one else had the key to her house, so for a few moments, she sat frozen, uncertain if she was hearing what she thought she was. Then the noises came again. Not soft noises, like someone trying to be stealthy. It sounded more like someone was rummaging around downstairs. My aunt locked her bedroom door and pressed her ear to the ground. She heard down below cabinets being opened and shut. She grabbed the phone from her room and called the police, and then hid in her closet. In retrospect, she laughs at the absurdity of her situation. Her phone was not wireless, so anyone who broke into her room would see the phone cord leading right to her closet. When the operator came online, my aunt started talking a mile a minute, saying that she was sure that there was someone in her house. The operator kept her on the line, and the next 15 minutes felt like 6 hours. During a pause in the conversation, my aunt heard footsteps coming up the stairs, followed by doors squeaking as someone peeked in each room. She then went dead silent as she heard someone pause outside her bedroom door. She didn't even notice the sirens outside until they were in her driveway. The following few minutes were a complete nightmare as she wondered why the cops weren't making entry into the house. The operator informed her that the police were just outside, but couldn't find any indication of a break-in. In a panic, she instructed them to break down the door. Almost immediately, there was a commotion on the stairs, and my aunt heard several voices screaming for someone to get down on the ground. After another moment, my aunt crawled out of the closet and went beside the bedroom door until a police officer knocked and told her it was okay to come out. My aunt wrapped herself in a long coat and followed the officer down the stairs and outside the front door. But before she reached it, she glanced over into the living room and saw the plastic shower curtain from her downstairs bathroom spread out across the floor, and her father's open toolbox was lying on the ground next to it, along with a couple of knives from the kitchen. She started hyperventilating, and they had to call an ambulance for her. After she recovered, the police let her look at the suspect through the squad car's tinted windows, and she recognized Harrison immediately. It turns out when he left her house, he grabbed her keys off the stairs and came back later and let himself in. The paramedics reported finding drugs in her system, and it was concluded that he had drugged her at the bar, but perhaps had used the wrong amount because it hadn't knocked her out as quickly or as deeply as he had intended. Harrison turned out to be a fake name. And what was the most strange about him, according to the police, was that he had no criminal record at all. He later died in prison from leukemia. Today my aunt shares the story willingly every time she's asked about it. There's even a running joke in our family not to buy her plastic shower curtains. I would like to start off by saying that if it wasn't for me stumbling upon this channel and getting royally freaked out by all the scary stories, I don't think my children and I would still be here today. A few weeks ago, on a Saturday morning, my kids and I were all sitting around the breakfast table enjoying some pancakes. My husband is doing his usual rushing around, getting ready for work because he had overslept yet again. As we were saying our goodbyes, I reminded him that the kids and I were going to the local splash pad for the afternoon. I never used to lock the doors to the backyard because it was fenced in with a locked gate, so I didn't see the need. Today though, I locked it out of paranoia because I had kinda gotten spooked from watching a Unit 522 video the night before. Even though a break-in was highly unlikely, I suddenly didn't feel like tempting fate and challenging a burglar. I got to doing chores around the house when I noticed it was raining outside. Figuring the splash pad was no longer an option, I left the room and tried to find an activity that would keep the kids occupied, and we ended up building a couch fort. After a short while, I got up and returned to the laundry room to check the machine. As I was preparing a new load, I noticed our back gate was wide open. I thought it was strange. Even with the wind, the lock should have held. The thought had barely finished forming in my head when my daughter came rushing into the kitchen and said, "Mommy, there's a man at the window. He waved at me." Feeling confident that my daughter's imaginative mind was playing tricks on her, I followed her back into the living room. My heart then stopped. On the other side of the window was a very dirty man, wearing a black tattered leather jacket. He had long, oily hair. He wasn't even trying to be discreet, and was staring directly into our house. He had his eyes on my son, who was sitting in the middle of the living room. "Hey, what are you doing? Get the hell out of my garden!" I shouted at him. He gave me the biggest, most malicious smile. In his right hand, he lifted a very large, bloody kitchen knife. Adrenaline and panic kicked in, and I grabbed my son and my daughter as calmly as I could. I took them upstairs and told them that we were playing a game of hide and seek, and that they needed to hide in the wardrobe and stay quiet. My daughter had enough sense to know that we were hiding from the man outside, but I assured her that the man was a friend, and she didn't have to worry. I walked back downstairs. I opened a closet door, grabbed the baseball bat, and held it over my head, ready to swing at anything. I went back to the living room window where the man had been standing. He was gone, but he left a bloody handprint on the glass. I grabbed my phone and called the police. After explaining the situation, they told me they would have an officer over as soon as possible. The officer arrived in a matter of minutes, and I showed him the bloody handprint on the window. He went outside to investigate. While he was doing that, I got my kids out from my bedroom. I sat them down and let them watch cartoons while I spoke to the officer, and he informed me that there were bloody fingerprints on my back door handle. The guy had been trying to get in. The next few hours were a blur. The officer called somebody out to take samples of the blood. They took my statement, and my husband took the rest of the day off to be with us. The officer contacted me and said they had arrested the man who was in the back garden. Apparently, the man had done the exact same thing to another family just 2 days after it happened to me. The blood on the window had been his own. According to the police, the guy had been recently released from a mental institution and had not been taking his medication. God only knows what he would have done to us if he had managed to get in. Maybe his intention was only to scare us, but maybe it was something far worse. I truly believe that Unit 522's channel saved me and my children that day. If it wasn't for my paranoia due to watching his videos, I think the outcome would have been completely different. So this happened at Christmas a couple years ago. When I was spending the holidays with my parents and little brother along with my cousins, aunts, and uncles. We live in a suburb in Ontario, but we were venturing out into the woods for Christmas, an idea that my parents had for a while. They always loved the idea of being out in a hunting cabin during Christmas with our family. I'm a 22-year-old female, but at the time, I was just turning 18, and my little brother Tom was 11. We're really close and we do everything together. We also had a dog, a German Shepherd named Trigger. He's a real softie, but he can be really overprotective, especially of my brother Tom. Anyway, we left our house on Christmas Eve at around 2 p.m. and climbed into our dad's truck, filled with all of our stuff and presents for his extended family. Tom and I were really excited, winding each other up, and my parents were having friendly conversation as we moved along the road. We arrived at the village near the cabins we were staying in and caught up with my dad's sister Billy, along with her husband and 3 kids. Billy was a bit unsure of where to go from the village to get to the cabins, but my dad helped her out by writing down the directions. We soon got back on our way and arrived at the cabins at around 4 p.m. There was a cluster of them sort of spaced out in the woods. Each family had a cabin, and there was one where everyone could meet up. It had a pool table, a swimming pool, and all sorts of other stuff. It was the kind of place where we could all just chill together and enjoy each other's company. Anyway, the weather was already really cold when we arrived, and the snow was falling all around us. So as me and my brother unpacked our things into the cabin and settled in for the night, my dad started a fire while my mom made our dinner. It was great. The Christmas decorations were already up, and we played a few board games as the night got darker. My dad, Tom, and I decided before going on the trip that we would all go hunting sometime. So we planned to go the next day. I had been a few times before with my dad, but this was Tom's first time. He was only there to watch us though, as he was still too young to shoot. It reached about 10 p.m., and my brother and I were getting a bit tired, so we decided to head to bed. My dad kept all of his rifles in a bag that was placed under the bed I was sleeping in. He would usually keep them in a locked box, but thought there was no point since we were going hunting the next morning. Tom and I were sharing a room at the end of the cabin, facing a flowing river. The view was beautiful. Tom and I fell asleep with our dog Trigger lying at the bottom of Tom's bed. Now this is when things begin to get creepy. It was about 3 a.m. when I awoke to Trigger growling. I didn't find this unusual because my dad suffers from insomnia, and sometimes when he can't sleep, he sits in our living room at home and watches some TV. Like I said, Trigger is extremely overprotective and growls at any noise he hears. But that's when I noticed that there was no light coming from under my door. My dad never just sits in the dark. I whispered to Trigger, telling him to be quiet as Tom slept, but his growling soon turned to barking, which woke Tom up. He asked me what was going on, but I said Trigger must have heard some deer or something outside. After all, we were in the middle of the woods. Suddenly, our bedroom door swung open, and the light switch was turned on. My eyes stung as I tried to focus on whoever was at the door. It was my dad. "Were you two laughing just now?" he asked, as he turned to look at Tom, his eyes wide and his face pale. "No," I replied as he moved over towards our curtain, pulling it back as he looked out into the pitch-black wilderness. "What are you looking at?" Tom asked as our dad closed the curtains again. "Nothing. Just go back to sleep." I was kind of creeped out that my dad didn't say anything about what he was doing, but he turned our light off and we tried to fall back asleep. Of course, I couldn't. I was wide awake for the rest of the night, flinching at pretty much every noise I heard. It was about 4:30 a.m. when I finally drifted off, but it must have been moments later I heard strange crunching noises coming from outside our window. I was sure it wasn't some animal. It sounded like footsteps. I had this overwhelming feeling of fear, and I pulled the covers over my face, sweat beginning to cover my forehead. I then heard a faint tapping on our window, which lasted a good few minutes. I was so petrified I couldn't move. Trigger was awake by this point, as I saw his face turn towards the window, his ears pointed, and listening intently. The tapping began again, a bit louder this time, causing Trigger to bare his teeth. What happened next was the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me.
"I know you're in there, little guy,"
this deep and husky voice whispered as a horrible shiver went down my spine.
Why don't you come out here and play with me?
Initially, I was filled with rage. The thought that it was bound to be one of my cousins playing a stupid prank on us. So I leaned forward and peeked through the gap in the curtain, ready to give them hell for scaring the shit out of us. But standing there wasn't any of our cousins. It was a creepy old man who was around 60. His hair was matted and his clothes looked dirty and ancient. He was stroking the window with his hands, breathing on it as he spoke. I went into protective mode. I didn't know what else to do, so I grabbed my dad's hunting rifle from under my bed and pulled the curtain back. "Get the hell out of here or I'll shoot!" I felt adrenaline rush through me as the creepy man's eyes widened, and the most terrifying smile appeared across his face. Trigger began barking louder than I've ever heard him bark before. My parents obviously heard the commotion and came running into the room, turning the light on. My mom screamed as she saw the old man through the window. Trigger continued barking furiously. My dad yelled at the man, telling him that the police were on their way, but the man just turned around and walked back into the woods. Tom was petrified, but I was just angry. How could some sicko do this? I was extremely glad that I had the rifle. The cops caught the guy just a few minutes later and arrested him. We found out a couple of days later that the man was homeless and living in the woods and was suffering from a lot of mental issues. It scares me to think about what would have happened to my brother if I wasn't there. We spent the remainder of Christmas Day at the cabin, but we stayed in our Aunt Billy's cabin overnight. There was no way that we were sleeping in our own after what happened. We went home the first thing the next morning and never looked back. My dad told me the other day that he knew someone was creeping around when he heard someone laughing and singing outside of the cabin before checking on us. So he intentionally left the rifle under my bed in case I had to use it in self-defense. He did that because he didn't want to scare any of us. He called the cops after he heard the guy laughing outside of his bedroom window. He knew it would take a while for the cops to reach the cabin. Safe to say, that was the scariest moment of my life. So this occurred many years ago, but it will forever stay with me and change my views on allowing my kids to ever have their own separate phone line. It was a few weeks after Christmas, and my parents had gotten me my own personal phone. That was cool back then, before cell phones got big. I had given my friends the number because who wouldn't, right? Anyways, it was around 3 p.m., and I had been sleeping when my phone begins to ring. I thought, who could be calling me this early when we all have to be up for school in the morning? So I answered it, but all I could hear was heavy breathing on the other end. I laughed it off as someone just messing with me and hung up. I tried returning to sleep, but my phone rang again. This time I answered it and said, "Who is this?" Again, I heard nothing but breathing. At this point, I was becoming irritated, and I told them to stop calling me and hung up. I laid down again for about 30 minutes when my phone rang for a third time that morning. I was so mad that I answered it and said, "This isn't funny. I'm trying to sleep. I have school in the morning. Stop calling me." This time there was a reply. It was a man's voice, and he laughed and said,
I can see you. You're very pretty. Why don't you come out and play in the snow with me?
I ran to my parents' room and woke up my mom, telling her what happened. She woke up my dad and made me tell him what happened as well. My dad then goes into my room and checks the windows and everything, making sure all the locks on the doors were secured, and proceeds to tell me that someone was just playing a sick joke and everything would be fine, and tells me just to unplug my phone from the outlet. So I finally go back to sleep until my mom wakes me up for school. I get up and start getting ready. I open my blinds to my window that overlooks the backyard and noticed on this very frosty morning that there were handprints all over my window. I freak out and yell for my parents. The police came out to take a report and look at the evidence. They went to the backyard, and sure enough, there was a set of footprints in the snow that led right up to my window. They had gone from the front of the house to my window, then to the back door, and then back to the front door. The police came to the conclusion that the guy had been trying to get inside.
There's always a reason to be afraid.
My childhood was far from idyllic. In fact, it was pretty horrific. Kids growing up today think they know what suffering is because they don't have the latest high-tech gadget, or were offended by something they saw online. I remember the nights where I would go entirely without food. Sitting in the corner of a crack house watching people exchange sexual favors for blow. My father would take all the money we earned together from power washing houses and would use it for his next fix. I was never his priority, only a tool from which he could benefit from. I grew up in the worst areas of the ghetto. I had to think like an adult very early in life to survive. At least once a week on my walks home from school, I would have to fight. That's just how it was. If you were weak, you wouldn't last. Fortunately for me, I managed to distance myself from my father and began to build a decent life for myself. I didn't let my upbringing define who I was. That's not to say that it didn't have a profound effect on my mind. I found a night job working on the docks unloading produce, and after a short while I met the woman who would eventually become my wife. We started a family together. Having that structure in my life helped to anchor me. Having people to care for kept me calm, and helped me not to lose myself in the terrible memories of my own upbringing. I thank God for my supportive wife and my kids. Without them, I'd probably be in prison or dead by now. My desire to just beat the shit out of drug dealers, deadbeat parents, or anyone who even remotely reminded me of my father would never be able to be repressed. Once enough time had gone by, I decided to try and make peace with my father and introduce him to my family. I wasn't thrilled with the idea and was worried about how I would react when I saw him face to face after so long. I figured as a father myself now, the best example I could set for my kids was to at least attempt to forgive him and try to permanently extinguish that furious wildfire of anger that was burning in my soul. So we reconnected and we set a date to meet at my house on a weekend. Now my father was a convicted felon and a piece of shit. I told him that to his face. I made it clear to him that I would be doing the world a favor by choking him to death and disposing of his body, and he seemed to acknowledge that I was right. I didn't want to give the impression that I was trying to bond with him. I was mostly looking just to make peace. Several times he said something that was overly familiar, and I had to not so subtly remind him that he had to watch himself. We eventually went out to my workshop after the kids had gone to bed and sat down to talk. We had some beers to take the edge off and began to have something of a civil conversation. We talked about other relatives and made some jabs about them that made us both chuckle. By the time 1 a.m. rolled around, I was 6 or 7 beers deep. I wasn't drunk, but I had a strong buzz going. I mentioned that I had an old friend who I used to work with at the docks, who we could score some weed from, and my father agreed to come with me. I gave my friend a call and wasn't surprised to find that he was still awake. We got into my father's car and drove for about 15 minutes before arriving at my buddy's trailer. He was an older guy, very much set in his ways, and not willing to provide us with any kind of discount on the merchandise. But we made a deal, rolled a joint, and shot the shit with him for a while. On our way back to my place, my father was driving, while I reclined in the passenger seat, disappointed in the quality of weed that we had paid too much for. It was about 2:30 in the morning, and the roads were empty. My father was driving about 65 on a 35 road. We rounded the corner and discovered a cop car planted right in the middle of the road. It wasn't off to the side, but instead sitting dead center on the median. My father immediately eased off the gas, but didn't hit the brake. We drove past the patrol car at about 55 miles an hour, and I watched in the rearview mirror as the cop's lights came on, and he began to follow us. I said something aloud to my father, along the lines of, "He's coming for us." My father acknowledged it and pulled off to the side of the road, next to a gas station. After the cop pulled up behind us, he shone his spotlight on us. I felt my heart sink. On top of the speeding, my father was a convicted felon. Both of us had drugs in our pockets, and I had a loaded gun under the seat. I looked at my father and said, "Okay, so here's the plan. I'm drunk as shit, and I called you to come pick me up and drive me home. You're pissed off at me because you were sleeping, but you're being a responsible parent. If the cop asks me to step out of the car, I'm going to stagger around like an idiot and make myself throw up." I feel like I should point out that I was still incredibly buzzed from the alcohol I had drank earlier, and on top of that I was being a bit paranoid because I had just burned one. It was a bad combination, but there was something stirring within me. something that I hadn't felt in a long time. The cop stepped out of his car and called over his loudspeaker for my father to step out of the vehicle with his hands up. My father complied, and I caught a glimpse of the officer. He was a very young man, maybe 21 or so. I turned back to the dashboard and made myself focus on it, and refused to turn my head in case I made eye contact with him. Now for some context, my father was shirtless and wearing a gold chain. I looked like I had been awake for days. The car was a piece of shit. Everything about us screamed trouble. From outside the car, I heard the officer speaking to my father. "Sir, is that alcohol I smell on your breath?" "Well, if it is, it's ancient." "How's that? I haven't had a drink all day." He asked my father where he was heading, and I heard him respond that he was driving his drunken son home, just like I had told him. A sudden idea struck me, and I pulled out my cell phone. I illuminated my screen and held it to my ear, and proceeded to pretend that I was arguing with my wife while being completely hammered. I made it loud so the cop could hear it. "Yes, honey. Yes. I'm on my way home now. I know you told me not to drink. Yes, I know. You were right. Honey, I'm sorry. I'm on my way home. I'm on my way home right now." I really made a show of being wasted and angry. I even threw in some stuttering to make it seem like she was interrupting me. I drowned out what the cop and my father were saying. In that time, a second cop may have pulled up behind us. For some reason, I got the sense of another car arriving, but I didn't know for sure because I refused to turn around. I continued to make myself stare at the dashboard. I felt more than I saw the cop coming around to my side of the car, and it was at that moment where all my thinking changed. I suddenly witnessed my life in a microscope and saw my wife and kids, and I thought about how proud I was of them. I could have just stayed home. Now I was here, at what might have been the most critically important moments of my life. I pulled the gun out from under the seat and cocked back the hammer. It was a fully loaded 7-shot revolver. In that moment, I felt like a passenger in my own body, and for some reason I thought I knew exactly what was going to happen. That feeling that I had earlier had taken over. I was convinced that the cop was going to open the door and put his gun in my face. You could not have told me otherwise in that moment, and I was prepared to shoot him. It wasn't even that I was considering doing it. The decision had already been made. It was like a stage play that had already been written, and we were now acting it out. He was going to attempt to arrest me, and there was no way that I would be separated from my family to rot in jail. I would rather die, which I knew was exactly what would happen if I shot him. Cop killers around here only ever went home in body bags. I watched the officer reach out for the door handle. The whole time I was thinking, this guy is dead, and he doesn't even know it. He could have had a wife and kids of his own, and tomorrow, they're going to be planning his funeral, just as my own family would be planning mine, and it was only a few moments away. It was going to be so easy. I would just extend my arm and fire as he opened the door. And then, I would shoot my father, eliminate that piece of shit from the world for all the suffering he had caused me, and for all the memories of the nights I went hungry. I knew that this was going to devastate my family, and I felt bad for them. I considered myself to be a good father, much better than my own had been, and I knew that they loved me. I felt the tears begin to come, and I didn't fight them. And I think that was the scariest part of this whole experience. I knew that what I was doing was beyond fucked up and irrational on almost every level, but I still was going to go through with it. I closed my eyes and waited for the car door to open, but that never happened. I opened my eyes, and the cop was gone. He was walking back to speak with my father again. From what my father told me, the officer approached my door and extended his hand to pull the handle. Then he paused for about 10 seconds. There was a silence, and the police officer shook his head, lowered his hand, and simply walked away. My father said that 10 seconds felt like a minute and a half. The cop cited my father for speeding and told him that he was a good parent. After my father got back in the car, we drove away in silence. Once we were about 6 miles away and the cop was long gone, I silently rolled down the window, pointed the gun outside, and fired all 7 shots into the ground. This startled my father so much that he swerved and nearly went off the road. He hadn't known about my gun. After I rolled the window back up, He looked at me and said, "You probably shouldn't carry a gun while you drink." And I replied back, "You and I shouldn't drink together at all." It had been exactly what I feared. Being in close proximity to my father brought all the painful memories back to the surface, and the worst side of me came with them. The side of me that was hostile, irrational, and violent. I had decided to kill a cop over a traffic stop without a second thought, and I'm positive that I would have done it had he opened the door. That was 5 years ago, and I haven't had a drink with my father since, and I can't afford to have him in my life anymore after what almost happened. And to be clear, I don't blame him for what I almost did. I blame myself. But being with him, especially after drinking, puts me in a frame of mind where I can no longer think rationally, and I remember the kill or be killed mentality from my childhood. I had nearly killed an innocent man over a bag of shitty weed. I truly feel that something divine stepped in between us that night and made that officer pause and reconsider opening that door. You can call it instinct or luck, but I consider luck finding a dollar bill under your car seat, not something that steps in the last moment to prevent tragedy.
I wanted to share this story so that it will serve as a reminder to always follow your gut. Don't ever assume that just because you're in your own home and you get a strange feeling that you're just being paranoid. I'll give you an example. Several months ago, right as autumn was beginning and the days were becoming shorter, I was home alone at the house I shared with my roommate. Seasonal depression sinking in, I decided just to stay inside and have a lazy evening. I was on the couch, flipping through Netflix, when I got this overwhelming sensation that something wasn't right. It wasn't just a feeling of guilt or doubt because I wasn't being productive. It actually felt as though the world around me wasn't in perfect alignment, like something was out of place. It's the feeling you get while you're driving and one of your tires is slowly deflating. Unable to shake this feeling, I stood up, shut off the TV and headed upstairs, not turning off any lights on the ground floor. Once upstairs, I turned on the hall light and entered the bathroom. I didn't feel like I was being watched necessarily, but I did feel this sense of invasion. I got some music playing on my phone and decided that I was going to take a shower, determined to distract myself and shake off this feeling. If I had had any pets, I would have looked to see how they were acting, but I didn't. I could only go off of how I felt, and I chose to ignore the feeling of unrest. Before I was done taking my clothes off, I thought I heard movement from downstairs. I muted my phone for a moment, but the noise didn't come again. I figured I was either hearing things or my roommate had returned home early and was downstairs. I didn't think for a moment that some stranger had entered my house. That's the type of thing that happened to other people. I forced myself not to think like that. I knew that all my doors were locked and I lived in a safe neighborhood. That's what I kept telling myself. I turned the shower on, finished getting undressed, and got inside. I stayed in the shower longer than I needed to. Being in there helped, but it didn't completely calm my nerves. As soon as I turned off the water, the feeling of invasion was back, and suddenly I decided that I needed to be very quiet. I stepped carefully out of the shower and turned off my phone. It was then that I noticed under the crack of the door there was a shadow of someone standing just outside, and the only thing standing between me and that person was an old wooden door and a latch lock that anyone could break if they threw their weight into it hard enough. I stared down at the shadow, and finally I allowed myself to panic. Had it been my roommate or a family member with a spare key, they wouldn't be standing that still. They would knock on the door and announce themselves if they needed anything. I didn't even hear anyone breathing. A scenario flashed through my head of me not noticing the shadow, throwing open the door in an obvious fashion, and having a knife driven into my gut as I fell into the arms of a masked stranger. I slowly put on my shorts and my shirt, and just stared at the shadow under the door, still unmoving. After another moment, I made a decision. I slowly began to open the bathroom window. I flushed the toilet and lifted on the wooden frame. I then stepped up and then hung my legs out the window. As I was sliding out fully on the roof, my head knocked against the blinds and made them rattle. I swear in that split second, my heart stopped, and I heard movement from outside the door. I leapt out the window right as I heard the door crash open behind me. When I slid across the roof, I immediately let myself fall to the cold ground. I picked myself up and sprinted across my lawn, without even bothering to look back to see if anyone was chasing me. I ran to my neighbor's house, pounded on the back door until they let me in, and I called the police from my phone after they locked the door behind me. When they got there, they searched my house and discovered that it was empty, but inside every single room they found evidence of footprints and signs that someone had been rummaging around through drawers and personal belongings. The intruder had been wandering from room to room while I was in the shower. Outside the living room window, they discovered very specific DNA that indicated that he was watching me as I was laying on the couch. This guy had patiently waited for me to leave the ground floor before entering the house through the back door. He then waited for me outside the bathroom when he could have easily broken in and grabbed me. There was 1,000 things that could have gone wrong that night. I could have ignored my gut feeling. The intruder could have been less patient. I could have shut lights off behind me. He could have waited down the hall instead of outside the door. I really believe that I had 1 in 100 chance of getting out of there, and I rolled the dice and beat the odds. I should be dead. I have no idea who that guy was, or why he chose my house, but I do know one thing for certain. I will never doubt my gut feeling again. Please take this to heart, everyone listening. Try to always be aware of your surroundings. Play it safe even if it feels silly, and never ignore your instincts. All throughout the mid to late 90s, I spent my time alternating back and forth between my parents who had divorced when I was 6. During the summer, I preferred staying at my dad's single-story ranch-style house in a quiet cul-de-sac as opposed to my mom's place in the city. My dad's place was much quieter and had a better feeling of privacy with its big fenced-in backyard. During the warmer months, I would enjoy sleeping with my window cracked open and my fan on. In the city, it was always too noisy to have a window open at night. I remember at the time my dad was usually working late and would arrive home around 8 p.m. or later, so the majority of the day I was alone. I would spend my time on my dad's computer, using the dial-up internet. Back in those days, if you wanted to use the internet, you had to keep in mind that you were sacrificing your ability to use the phone. You also had to sit at a desk all day when you surfed the web. On this particular day, it was getting pretty late, and I had been sitting for a while, so I decided to get up and make myself a snack. The sunlight was fading outside, and it was just starting to get dark. But I didn't turn on any lights as I walked down the hallway and turned into the kitchen. Using the light from inside the fridge, I began to shuffle around looking for something to make a sandwich out of, when I heard something that made me pause. Back inside my room, I had a lamp on my nightstand that had these tiny charms hanging from the shade. Whenever I went to raise or lower my window, the nightstand would shake, and the charms would make tiny wind chime type sounds. I was used to the sound, but I had never once heard it from outside my room, because I was the only one who ever touched my window. And for such a small sound, I was surprised how far it traveled. There was this animalistic moment where my entire body froze, and I felt my sense of hearing dial itself up to 11 as I strained to catch every small noise coming from my room. I heard a couple of footsteps on my carpet, some muffled voices, and I heard the creak of my door opening. I let the fridge door swing shut and rushed over to the back door, but as soon as I opened it, I paused. Out the back door led to our screened-in back porch, which led outside to our fenced-in yard. Going through the screen door would make way too much noise, and whoever was now in the house would be able to catch me before I was able to unlock the gate to exit the backyard. I would have to run back towards the intruders to get to the front door. So not knowing what else to do, I ducked into a small closet right next to the fridge, where my dad kept the vacuum. There was barely enough room inside for me to stand up straight, and I knew that if they happened to open the door, I was caught. So I kept my hand on the doorknob to hold it closed. I heard 2 sets of footsteps walking down the front hall, and suddenly somebody was in the kitchen. He wasn't even being cautious. He was just sauntering around, opening cabinets and drawers like he belonged there. I heard him open the fridge right next to me and knock a few things around inside. I heard an annoyed voice coming from the hallway. "What the hell are you doing?" The second voice responded. "I'm starving, man. I haven't eaten all day. Get the fuck out of there." The first voice snapped. The fridge door shut abruptly, and suddenly there was a tug on the handle of the closet I was hiding in. I tensed, and I held the door latch firm. All the guy had to do was pull on it hard, and I would have toppled right onto the floor. "Hey, this one's locked." The voice came from right outside the door. As soon as I heard it, I knew I was done. and I mentally prepared myself to be kidnapped or murdered. The second voice came again over by the back door.
Hey, did you open this? No, why? And somebody was just here. You must have run out back.
I heard both of the intruders run out to the back porch. I could have taken that moment to run, but I was shaking so hard at me nearly getting caught that I didn't trust myself to try and take a step. I thought about trying to go for the cordless phone on the counter, but I remembered the dial-up internet was still using the phone line. After another few moments, the two men ran back into the house and made for the front door. I heard the front door unlock and swing open. They hadn't been out of the house for more than 5 seconds before I heard a police siren wailing as it drove past the house. Turns out my neighbor had spotted the two men walking around outside and called the cops as soon as she noticed them opening my window from the outside. They were kids themselves, really. One was 18 and the other was 19. My dad arrived home shortly after, and we ended up staying at my aunt's for the night. I was incredibly shaken for the next several days, and the smallest of noises made me anxious, and I was too afraid to be alone. Looking back now, those two kids likely would have taken off running if they had found me. They didn't even have any weapons on them. But at the time, I didn't know that, and the experience traumatized my tiny 11-year-old mind. Who would have thought on a quiet cul-de-sac with houses surrounding me on all sides, and the sun not even completely gone, that my house would be invaded? The city may be noisier, but at least at the time, it was safer. My friends and I live in the hills of Moville, Northern Ireland. Last year, the four of us were walking along the cliffs by the seaside and arguing about Conor McGregor, when my friend pointed out a row of power lines running up away from the road and further up into the trees. Had we not been thrown out of the pub we normally frequented the previous night, we probably would have just headed right back into town for a drink. But given that we had nowhere better to be, we decided to try and find out where exactly these lines led to. The area we were walking was extremely rugged, and the closest thing to a road that led through the trees was 2 tracks of flattened ground where vehicles had clearly passed before. We walked deeper into the woods, half concentrating on the power lines and half on the wheel marks, just making dull conversation and not expecting to find anything interesting, until the wheel marks just ended. The power lines fell off the last pole, a few yards beyond where the wheel marks stopped, and kind of wound their way through the tree branches. To clarify, they weren't broken, just kind of awkwardly placed across the tree limbs, which I had never seen before. My buddy wandered deeper into the trees and discovered a 6-foot-tall wire fence encircled in a small clearing, with a 2-story stone house sitting there like a lost heirloom. We circled the fence until we found the gate, which was carelessly hanging open, and we walked right up to the front door. Privacy and common sense were not present. The first thing I noticed was that there were security cameras mounted outside the house, pointing in various directions, and I considered what kind of person would go through all the trouble of setting up cameras just to leave the gate open. It didn't end there. The front door was open as well. The four of us walked right inside like we owned the place. I hesitated in the entryway, while my friends immediately split up to look around. I went to shut the door behind me, and spotted 4 deadbolts on the inside frame, and suddenly I had a very strong feeling that it wasn't right that we were all just trespassing here. One of my friends found one of those metal detecting wands on the kitchen counter, like the ones you see TSA agents using in airports, and in a back room another friend found 2 backup generators. Despite them being there, it was obvious the power hadn't been working in the house for quite some time. The whole place smelled musty, like the outside forest had invaded it with its cold, earthly scent. I asked if it was possible that this was a secret military base of some kind, but one of my friends pointed out that there was no weapon cabinets, and there hadn't been any checkpoints outside either. I wanted to leave, but the others decided that they wanted to search upstairs, which turned out to be one giant room. There was a cot in the corner, but most of the room was occupied by a long table, with chairs and a flat-screen TV mounted to the wall, which I presume was meant to view the footage from the security cameras. While the other guys dug through the drawers looking for anything interesting, my friend Eamon started fidgeting with the flat screen, like he was going to take it down off the wall and carry it under his arm over the hills the whole way back to his own place. The whole time I just stood by the steps impatient and ready to leave. I was starting to get the sense that this place was some very paranoid person's hideaway and that he may have left in a hurry.
This house was very much hidden away where no one would think to look. I admired the view from the window, where I could just make out the sea through the trees, and then I turned to head downstairs, and that's when I froze. There were black marks, like ash, staining the carpeted stairs to about the halfway point. That definitely had not been there when we climbed the stairs. I spoke aloud. "Whoa, wait. How?" And then the smell hit me. There was a burning fabric scent in the air that washed over me, and I immediately coughed and started panicking. I hesitated for a moment before rushing down the stairs, keeping as close to the sides as I could, and then I went right out the front door without looking back, my friends following close behind, each of them making remarks about the sudden burning stench in the air. I asked if anyone had tracked the ash on the stairs, but I already knew the answer. Not only had none of us tracked marks across the carpet, but none of us had only gone halfway up the stairs. I suddenly had the horrific thought that someone else had been in the house with us the whole time. We immediately left the area and headed back to the coastline. Halfway back, we heard a loud roar from behind us. It could have been an animal, but to me it didn't sound impartial. It sounded infuriated. I decided that I didn't want to be involved at all after that. But a couple of my friends went back a few days later. They told me that there had been a burned spot directly outside the entrance to the stone house, and when they sifted through the loose soil, they had pulled an entire Ouija board out of the dirt. Sometime later, I talked with another friend of mine about it over a couple of beers, and he told me that he had heard rumors that there was a group of psychotic people who lived out in those woods, and they believed in things like ancient curses and demonic possession, and that they were known to be violent towards outsiders. I don't know what was going on in the house that day, but I feel like we were very lucky that we didn't encounter anyone while we were there, and that we all made it out in one piece. I used to work as a haunted house technician at Busch Gardens in Williamsburg, Virginia. During the months of September and October, the park would put out an event called Hollow Scream. The park transformed into a massive Halloween-themed experience with multiple uniquely themed attractions, such as vampires, zombies, and clowns. The haunted house that I worked at was called Fear Fair, which consisted of a maze that branched in between several buildings and tents. I was there to maintain the maze and fix anything that broke over the course of the night. Sometimes the guests would punch our spooky decorations out of fear, or tripped over each other and knocked over some lights. It kept me pretty busy. While the maze was open, I was normally just out of sight making adjustments to the audio and checking in with my coworkers on my walkie-talkie. One Saturday evening, there was a heavy downpour, which deterred much of our potential business. I used the downtime to work on the wooden frame that served as the entrance to the maze. I placed a sign across the line entrance stating that the maze was temporarily closed, and then I got to work. After a few minutes, I left to go pick up another tool I needed from the maintenance shed, and when I got back, I noticed someone strolling around, walking down the tunnel deeper into the maze. He was a young man, maybe in his late teens, with a dark complexion, long braids, and was wearing a dark blue tank top. The only way in was past the sign, so I was irritated, not only that he was trespassing, but because I had disassembled part of the wall, and if anything had tipped over or fallen, he could have been hurt. I called out to him. "Sir, we're not open yet. Did you need help with something?" Up until that point, his back was turned to me, and when I called out, he visibly jumped. And I couldn't help but think, geez, he's freaked out and nothing's even turned on yet. He gave me a strange look, like he was sizing me up, and for half a moment I thought he was going to try something. But instead he responded, "No, I just thought you were open now." I explained to him that Fear Fair would reopen shortly after I finished my repairs. He nodded and walked past me out the entrance, without making eye contact with me again. I decided just to give him the benefit of the doubt and assume that he was just impatient and wanted to take a look at the maze. After I was done assembling the entryway, I took the sign down and started to prepare the maze. The scare actors arrived on time and took their positions, but there wasn't very much business that night. The grounds were all soaked from the rain, and we probably had more employees than guests wandering around the attraction. Shortly after 9 p.m., I was getting ready to close the maze for the night, as it looked like it was going to start raining again. That's when one of the actors walked up to me and took me aside. Hey, I didn't want to say anything over the radio, but there's this guy with braids and a tank top back in the corridor behind the maze. I don't recognize him, and I don't know why he's there. I immediately remembered the trespasser from before, and made my way to the back corridor. I turned on all the back lights, and poked around any place I suspected would give an intruder enough room to hide. I peeked out the back exit and shined my flashlight around, but I still didn't see anything. I locked the back door, and then walked through the maze instructing all the scare actors that they could leave. I turned off the fog machines and switched on the overhead lights, so I could get a better look around. It wasn't unusual for drunken guests to wander out of the boundaries, but if this was the same guy I had seen before, I was worried that he may be waiting, and just might be stalking one of the actors. It doesn't really calm your nerves wandering through an empty maze filled with horrific life-sized mannequins of demon clowns, trying to find someone who may or may not actually be there. Somehow being silent in there made it even worse, because then you start to question whether or not the faint sounds you do hear are from your own imagination. After another 15 minutes, I decided the maze was truly empty, and started shutting off everything behind me as I made my way back towards the entrance. Just as I had switched off another set of lights behind a hidden circuit board and was standing in the dark, I heard the footsteps coming loud and fast. I heard them coming from across the room, making a beeline towards me. In response, I turned on my flashlight and shone it in the direction of the footsteps, and saw that it was the same guy from before, charging right at me with a prop mallet. When my flashlight beam hit his face, he slowed down for a moment, stunned and blinded, and I took that opportunity to book it out of there. I knew the maze better than this guy did. I could navigate it well enough to keep ahead of him. Sure enough, I heard him cursing and bumping into things behind me as I ran. Once I exited through the opening of the maze, I waved down 2 security guys who covered the entrance until the police arrived. The local police were always on call nearby in case a fight broke out or someone was injured. They went into the maze without hesitation and emerged about 5 minutes later with the guy in cuffs. He had surrendered peacefully, and he almost looked as though he was relieved that the whole thing was over. The police informed me that this kind of thing was actually pretty common. As part of a local gang's initiation ritual, the new recruit must sneak into a park, find a weapon and a place to hide, and record themselves knocking somebody out, and then leave the park through the front gate like any other customer. That mallet may have only been a prop, but it was still made of wood, and had he brought it down on my head hard enough, it would have knocked me out cold. Had he not been so obvious with his attack, I would have never seen it coming. After they took my attacker away, the police swept the entire park and found 2 more young men hidden and waiting for an opportunity to strike someone. None of this ever made the local news. I suspect that the park didn't want that kind of publicity. Ever since then, I've made it mandatory that any employees wandering through the attractions have to travel in pairs. About 5 years ago, when I was 16, I was living in western Pennsylvania in a heavily forested area. On this particular night, I was home alone with my younger brother, while my mom was out at a baby shower. I was in the kitchen making dinner for myself when I heard a knocking on the front porch. This wasn't a common knock, like someone might be waiting for me to open the door. It was more like a few loud taps close to one of the front windows. I paused and glanced around. From where I stood in the kitchen, I could see the front door and one of the front windows. All the lights on the ground floor were on, and with it being dark outside, all I could see in the windows was a reflection of the inside of my living room. I waited for a few moments, but when the sound didn't come again, I shrugged it off and continued concentrating on the stove. After maybe 5 minutes, long enough for me to forget about the sound, it repeated itself, this time from the front window at the far side of the house. "Mark?" I called out, thinking it might have been my brother. There was no response. I walked over to the front of the house and peered outside with my hands pressed to the side of my face, but I couldn't see anything. I turned as my brother came down the stairs. "Did you just hear something from around back?" he said. I held up a finger to indicate that we should pause and listen, and almost on cue, we heard footsteps calmly walking across the wooden floor of our wraparound porch, just outside the dining room wall. "There's someone out there," I said quietly, more angry than scared. It was at this point that we should have locked all the doors and called out the window that we were calling the cops, but I was a stupid, headstrong kid, and pissed off that someone was messing with us. I remember my brother asking if the person outside was trying to distract us, but I was already at the gun cabinet. I should point out that I was raised with guns, and I knew how to properly handle one. I pulled out the 9mm from the drawer and loaded it. I'm going to scare him off, I told my brother. Lock the front door behind me. Before I could even give him a chance to argue, I was marching to the door with the gun in my hands. I threw open the door and stepped out into the porch. My brother then flicked on the outside lights, and right there, about 8 feet in front of me, was a sickly thin guy wearing a hoodie with light blue eyes and a soul patch on his chin. He had been in the process of stepping onto the porch, but the moment he saw me, he spun around and ran like a bat out of hell. I took off running a few yards after him, then stopped, pointed my gun in the air, and fired off a shot. "That's right, fuck off!" I cried out. I waited until he disappeared into the trees before turning around to face the house. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that for a few moments my heart stopped. I felt that momentary wave of ice water through my veins, and the painful thudding of my heart in my chest as it tried to correct its rhythm. There was at least 8 other people standing around my porch, and a handful more scattered around the yard. They were mostly men, but there was also at least 2 women, all dressed in dark jackets and hoodies, looking mostly like they were in their early 20s. None of them said anything. Instead, they all just stared at me, their hands mostly in their pockets, and I couldn't tell if any of them had weapons. Then they all just scattered. Some jogged away, but most of them just walked off in different directions out into the woods. I legitimately forgot for a handful of seconds that I was holding a gun, until I raised my hands to my face and felt its weight. I sprinted back to the front door and pounded on it until my brother let me back in. I had no idea what to tell him. I had just fired a gun up into the air, and none of them had cried out or made any sound whatsoever. Had they had been drunk or something and were trying to pull a prank, they would have said something. It would have been like, "Whoa, sorry man, wrong house, put down the gun." But all they did was just look at me, like I had just ruined their surprise attack, and more disappointed than scared, they all just wandered off. I had no idea what to make of it. My brother turned on all the lights in the house and called the cops, who to their credit arrived within 10 minutes and swept the perimeter. There were footprints everywhere, and they asked my brother and I numerous times if we had just had a party. I kept telling them a dozen or more people had just been loitering around our house in the darkness, but the cops didn't seem to take it that seriously. They asked if the strangers had threatened us, and I had to admit that they didn't in any direct way. They confiscated the handgun after I told them that I fired off a round, but they eventually returned it. I have no idea to this day what those people were doing that night outside of our house. My brother suspects that they were part of some kind of cult, and maybe had been setting up to perform some kind of ritual, and maybe that we were set to be human sacrifices. I thought it more likely they intended to break in and rob us, but saw the gun and bailed. That doesn't explain the silence though. None of them uttered so much as a sound as they looked at me and just, as if instructed by some signal, scattered all at once. I've read that during alleged UFO sightings, people can become hypnotized by lights that appear above them, and they wake up hours later in entirely new locations having no idea what happened or how they got there. I can't dismiss that kind of possibility. They all seem to be hypnotized. That group of people has never returned, and I haven't even caught a glimpse of anyone I recognized from that night in town. We bought a dog not long after. Back when I was in high school, my brother and 2 cousins ventured out on a long hike through miles of empty forest wilderness behind our house. We had explored the woods plenty of times as kids, but this time we wanted to go deeper than we had ever gone before, with food, flashlights, and knapsacks and everything, fully aware that we would probably be gone for several hours, and possibly might have to end up stopping and camping for a night. I did my best to mark a route for us using a map and compass. It was stupid. 4 kids under the age of 17 thinking that we could safely travel that deep into the sticks without anything happening, but we were young and confident, and none of our parents tried to talk us out of it. I was the oldest and the largest. I carried the compass and most of the supplies, including the tents and water. My brother Joe carried the first aid kit and flashlights, while my cousins Lily and Tom split the food between them, and Lily carried the flare gun. We only had 1 shot to use, and assumed that would be enough. We walked the majority of the day without incident, and after a few hours we spotted in the distance a wooden structure sticking up out of a tree line. Uncertain of what it was, we made for it, deciding that that was where we should set up camp. The sun was just starting to set by the time we reached it, and it turned out to be a very old overlooked tower, probably for spotting forest fires. We estimated that it was probably 60 or 70 feet high, but it would be perilous to climb. The staircase was a single winding path that wound up the perimeter of the tower, without any support beams. We dropped our bags at the base of the stairs, and debated on how high we should climb. Lily and I wanted to make for the top, but Joe and Tom didn't trust the stairs, worried that they could give way beneath us. Lily and I made our way up slowly, placing one careful foot in front of the other. When I was about halfway up, a rotted plank broke from beneath me, and my whole leg sank down through the wet wood. I came down at an odd angle and bent my right leg. I cried out and pulled my left leg through the hole as I sank down to sit carefully on the stairs. Tom and Joe heard my cry and started up the stairs, and Lily in turn started back down, which probably wasn't the smartest thing to do, but we were all panicking kids. When the others got to me, I immediately started insisting that I was okay, and that we all couldn't be up here this high on this weak staircase, and we should start heading back down. Joe was the first to reach the bottom when he stopped, pointed towards a nearby tree, and yelled, "Hey you!" We all looked. There was someone standing by a tree just looking at us. We couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, but the figure was extremely lanky with a ridiculous amount of gray hair and wearing an ancient jacket and jumpsuit. It looked like they had been just peeled off from the bottom of a dumpster. The four of us froze, and we all just stared. None of us knew what to say as the figure just stared at us. Then the stranger came towards the stairs. We freaked out and all scampered as fast as we could, right back up the stairs towards the platform. I stopped about 2/3 of the way up and looked back. The person was going through our bags at the base of the stairs. I then yelled, "Get the fuck out of there!" while the others tried to open the trap door at the top of the stairs. The figure looked up at me and called out something that I couldn't understand. I'm not sure if it was because the others were making so much noise right above me, or because the stranger wasn't speaking English. It was a very high-pitched voice, so I assumed at that point it was a woman. I pulled out a small pocket knife and sat there, waiting for her to follow us up. She didn't. She sat at the base of the stairs, ate our food, and pocketed most of our things. When it became full dark out, she was still sitting there, and we were all unsure of what to do. We couldn't get up onto the platform, and we couldn't see enough to know if it was safe enough to climb down. I know what you might be thinking.
You chicken shits, just go down and grab her.
And that very thought crossed my mind several times during the night, but without flashlights, and given the fact that I was injured, I didn't want to risk it. She could have had a weapon on her for all I knew. She most definitely had access to the flare gun, not that it would have helped us much if we had it. With the platform above us, we couldn't fire it straight up to signal for help. By the time first light of dawn peeked through the trees, I was stiff, very hungry, and sore. Joe, Tom, and Lily spent a sleepless night trying to remain quiet and not shift their weight very often. The figure down below was gone. We limped to the bottom of the stairs. We grabbed what possessions we had left, and Tom and Joe helped me hobble back home on one leg. It was the longest 14 hours of my life, from when I hurt my leg on the stairs to the moment I sank down in agony on my couch at home and took off my boots. To this day, I still have no idea who that woman was. Most likely some homeless weirdo hiding out in the forest, where no one could bother her. We also didn't know why the trapdoor wouldn't open. Tom presented the idea that someone may have locked it from atop the platform. Not sure how that would work. As miserable as this experience was, we all made it back shaken and exhausted. And other than my hurt ankle, we were all unscathed. It didn't occur to me until much later that hurting my leg may have saved us all. What if we had camped on the ground that night? And while we were all asleep, the strange woman had crept into our camp. I think it could have been a whole lot worse. This is one of those experiences that sticks with you regardless of how much time passes. The kind that you make sure you tell your friends and family when reminiscing about scary experiences. This took place during my high school days back in 2008. Starting high school wasn't exactly the best time in my life. I despised the politics of the high school microcosm, and I didn't get along with most of the students or the teachers. I was kind of an outcast. I decided that I was through with school because I saw it as nothing but a toxic environment and a waste of my time. This naturally didn't go over well with my parents. My mother is a school teacher, so I would have to hear those lectures about how education is the foundation for the rest of your life, blah blah blah. Looking back from where I am now, I can agree. But I was an impulsive teenager with a lack of common sense. After about a year, I enrolled in an alternate school called Moore Mickens, which was a place of sanctuary for pregnant teenagers and dropout rejects like myself. They offered me the opportunity to obtain a high school diploma in a special program that would allow me to graduate a year earlier than what I was supposed to. I was originally class of 2011, but with this program I was now officially class of 2010. Shave a year off my sentence? Sign me up. I went through the process of being enrolled, and before I knew it I was hopping on the bus for my first day of my sophomore-junior year. I couldn't help but bask in the admiration of flunking my freshman year, and yet was still one step ahead of my former classmates. When I arrived, it was basically back to square one for me. I was surrounded by young women in various stages of pregnancy, and young men with time in juvenile hall under their belts. Needless to say, I didn't exactly fit in with the crowd, so I sat alone in the cafeteria during breakfast and stared off into space, speaking to no one. Until this dude I recognized walked through the lunchroom doors. His name was George, and he was one of the very few people I actually talked to at my previous high school. We weren't exactly close friends or anything, but he was the only person I knew at Moore Mickens. It turns out we were pretty much in the same boat. I waved him over and we made small talk and reconnected. Later that day, my sister offered to pick me up from school, so after classes were over, I went outside to the parking lot to wait for her. George had someone picking him up as well, so we got to talking again. "How was your day, man?" "It sucked." "I hear you, man. People are so fucking stupid. I wish I could just kill them all." Yeah, sure. "I'm serious. I would totally bring a gun to mow them all down. I fucking hate people." "Yeah, sure. Hey, there's my sister. I'll catch you later." George went silent and gave me a blank stare as I quickly made my way to the car. Now you're probably wondering why that conversation didn't raise any red flags, but I had about a million things on my mind. So I brushed off the morbid conversation as just bitter adolescent talk. The next day, the class schedule alternated, and George and I ended up having the same art class. On a side note, the art teacher and I were cool, because she would let me draw pictures of skulls and zombies and stuff instead of doing the lame-ass work she assigned. Anyway, I was sitting at a table with George and two other guys. The two dudes were talking to each other, and I was drawing this sweet picture of Iron Maiden's The Trooper. George suddenly got up and walked over to the classroom door and ripped down a map of the school that was taped to the wall next to the door. He brought it back to the table and proceeded to mark on it with a red pen. One of the other guys asked him what he was doing. "You'll see. Everyone will." Even then, I didn't think too much of it, even though I remembered the conversation we had at the parking lot. You have to understand that George seemed to get off on the uncomfortable attention he got being vague and creepy, and this school was meant to be a place for outcasts. I figured he was just imagining some fucked up fantasy or something. A couple of days after that, I was walking to art class again, but just before I entered, the door opened and a police officer left the room escorting George away, followed by the principal. I froze in genuine shock and dread, and all I could think was, oh shit. George was staring right at me with cold eyes as he passed, and I had to look away. Turns out, I wasn't the only person he hinted to about his twisted aspirations. The school was full of young parents after all, and apparently they took his behavior as more of a threat than I did, and in retrospect I don't blame them. They found some stuff on his MySpace page that alluded to some sort of plot to shoot up the school. Here in Florida, threats like that are taken very seriously, even if it is just some fucked up teenager spouting some bullshit because he hates his life. It turns out the police found more than 28 firearms at his home, although to be fair they were all registered to George's grandfather and were kept in a locked gun cabinet. Though I suppose getting access to the guns wouldn't have been too difficult for someone like him. Thankfully George was taken away, and nothing ever came of his plans. Sadly, Moore Mickens was shut down a few years ago. Aside from this incident, I ended up having some pretty good times there. I got my act together, and ended up graduating in the class of 2010. I can't say for sure if George would have gone through with it, but I'll never forget the cold certainty behind what he said that day in art class. "You'll see. Everyone will." I had a friend who once lived on 40 acres of heavy forest in marshland. Once the warmer weather began, we would put together a group of 6 people and go paintballing, playing on teams of 3. In my mind, there is absolutely no better place to paintball because the terrain varied from rocky to wetlands, from steep to smooth, depending on the area we chose to use. It was entirely private property, so there was no chance of running into anyone else or being reported for trespassing. And since the area was so expansive, we would often find ourselves playing somewhere new on the property that we had never been to before. We would normally use quads or dirt bikes to travel to different sections of the property, and on the afternoon that this happened, we drove until the tanks were half empty, and then traversed another quarter-mile on foot, before we drew lots for teams and scattered into the woods. The theme of that battle was Marvel vs. DC, so each of us had assigned ourselves a code name of a comic book villain from whatever side we were on. I found a small bluff to use as an overwatch point, and picked out a spot to hide for a few minutes while I adjusted my helmet and boots. Once I stopped shifting my weight around, I knelt down for a few moments, and then I heard the sound of uncontrolled sobbing coming from nearby behind me to the south. For a moment I considered that it could be one of my friends, but after I removed my helmet, I listened more closely. I realized the voice was much too deep. It sounded like a fully grown adult crying like a drunk at a funeral. I debated whether to ignore it, but my curiosity got the better of me. Setting aside the fact that this was private property, and no one but us should have been this deep into the woods, the man sounded like he might have needed some help. About halfway to the source of the noise, I encountered one of my teammates who had also heard the sobbing and decided to investigate. The two of us moved forward together with our paintball guns up, knowing full well that if we were walking into actual danger, they wouldn't be very useful at all. After another moment, we discovered a crumbling 2-story brick house that looked to us as though it had been standing there since the Civil War. The sobbing and wailing was coming from one of the upstairs windows, though by this time it had died down considerably. The friend who lived on the property wasn't there with us, otherwise we would have just had him deal with it. What we should have done was go back for help, but again we were curious and concerned that this sobbing man may have been in some kind of trouble. We carefully entered through the busted front door, not making a sound to announce ourselves. All the windows were missing, so the inside had a damp outdoors feel to it. There was dirt, leaves, and rusty beer cans all over the floor, and despite it being so drafty, the place reeked of pot and sweat, and someone had spray painted the words, "Stay here," on one of the inner walls. Once we got to the base of the stairs, I decided the tension had gone on long enough, and I called out, "Hey, are you alright up there?" It was like I had awoken a grizzly bear. Someone upstairs roared with insane fury and came charging towards the top of the stairs with purpose. Dust fell from the ceiling as the stranger upstairs came sprinting forward to attack. We turned and launched ourselves back out the front door and back out into the trees as the screams of a haggard man warned us to back off. We took position in the trees in case the guy decided to follow us. That way we could open fire at him with paintballs and at least slow him down. But once he got to the front door, he paused, squinting stupidly at the daylight for a moment, before heading back inside. We each only caught a glimpse of him. Imagine the sweatiest, scraggliest beard, attached to an old scarecrow with about 14 layers of solid coats on. We marked our position as best we could, and headed back. When we finally got back to our friends, they reported that they had run into 2 very drunk and furious homeless-looking guys, who had charged at them for a few yards before they were forced to defend themselves by firing off several paintball rounds and driving their attackers away. We booked it back to the bikes, drove back to our friend's house, and called the police. A patrol car showed up there in about 20 minutes, but no one headed out into the woods for close to an hour, until there were enough men gathered to head out and investigate and have air support from a helicopter. It wasn't until after dark that we discovered at least 4 homeless men had been living in that old brick house, and one of them had died in the night, likely from an overdose of some kind. 2 of them had wandered off to go look for a car to carry him away and bury him. The third had stayed with him and sobbed uncontrollably over the death of his friend. Apparently the place was well known in the homeless community as somewhere that you could go to disappear for a while. Even though there were several knives found in the house, none of the men had any weapons on their person when they were found and arrested for trespassing. My friend's parents have since scheduled the small house to be demolished, and were completely unaware it had been there to begin with. That's my story. Perhaps not the scariest encounter ever, but it definitely put life into perspective for us. We were just dumb kids out having fun without a care in the world, and unknowingly stumbled across a safe haven for men whose lives were hopeless and fueled by drugs. Had we not been so careful, some of us or all of us may have never made it back to the house alive, and who knows how long it would have taken before our bodies were discovered.
There's always a reason to be afraid.